What's up, party people, and welcome to Countdown to Classic. This is a podcast that educates, informs, and gossips about World of Warcraft Classic. Each week we discuss the news, hot button issues, and content of the highly anticipated Classic servers. I'm your host, Josh Corbett, and this is a show where it's not my opinion on World of Warcraft that counts, but yours. If you're new to the show, Countdown to Classic goes through your expert input on everything relating to the sure-to-be-amazing World of Warcraft Classic. Today, we're taking on a number of calls as the show dives into a couple of deep topics. Firstly, we'll hear from Gamasutra and The Verge contributor Katherine Cross, all about the nostalgia factor for WoW Classic. After that, we'll take a number of listener calls on the topic of World of Warcraft, or gaming in general, addiction and depression, which saw me chatting with a listener with a background of work in addiction clinics, as well as other listeners who were kind enough to share some personal stories about their own addiction in the past. After that, we'll head back to the forums and take an accompanying call on another topic that got the community all abuzz recently, spell batching. Also, listen carefully to this episode, as at some stage you'll hear how you can enter Countdown to Classic's Christmas giveaway of a couple of copies of Warcraft 3 Reforged when that game is released. You all know the drill by now. This is a community-based podcast, so if you like what you're hearing, join the Discord and keep the conversations going with all of us over there. Follow the show on social media and also email me if you'd like to call into the show, make a suggestion, or just say hi. Everything you'll need is in the show notes for each episode. Now, let's get into it with Calling Countdown. Okay, we've got another Countdown to Classic caller on the line, and a very big Countdown to Classic welcome to Katherine Cross. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Katherine.
It's more than my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute delight to have you on the show. Now, if listeners aren't aware, I reached out to you this past week on Twitter after an article that you published in, I always get this wrong, is it Gamasutra, I'm presuming how it's pronounced?
It's actually Gamasutra, but everyone pronounces it their own way, and that's part of the fun.
Well, that's what I thought, because obviously you think Kama Sutra, that would flow on with the Gamasutra, but then with the gaming thing, I was like, I really don't know how to say this. But there you go. Okay, Gamasutra. So Gamasutra.com ran an article that you published recently, obviously about World of Warcraft Classic. And you presented a very, very eloquent argument for the fact that gamers may very well be getting not only caught up in nostalgia, but also you raised the argument that many of the Classic sort of devotees have wondered about is really how successful will this game be? Will World of Warcraft Classic maintain its audience, or will it give them enough to keep people coming back for more? And I did appreciate the way that you put your argument forward, and I was so happy that you agreed to come on the show to obviously, you know, as one of the show's themes being, you know, somewhat of a contrary voice to some of the fans that come on the show. And we're all so wild about WoW Classic when we're rabid for it. But, you know, I think it is important to also take another step in the other direction and think, well, will this thing succeed? So let me ask my first question, and that's, after you wrote the article, how was the reception of it, and what's happened in the aftermath?
Well, the reception was quite divided. There were certainly some people who appreciated what I had to say. There were a number of others, particularly on Twitter, who were less than enthusiastic. and were upset that I seemed to be sort of, pissing in their Cheerios about something they were excited about, which I honestly, if that is how they felt, then I do feel a bit bad about that. That was not my intent at all. But, there were certainly some people who thought that I was being very unfair, or that I was not giving enough credit to the existing community of private server fans, right? Who are seen as sort of the core constituency for WoW Classic. And, that was sort of what happened in response to it. But there were also a lot of positive responses, people who appreciated that I stepped up to provide, as you said, a contrary opinion. And, a lot of those people, like me, are World of Warcraft fans. It's, we're not rooting against WoW here, but more just we have some concerns.
Absolutely. And I think you raised a couple of very good points that really should be food for thought for the Classic fans. And I know a lot of my listeners will be listening right now, sort of maybe perhaps rubbing their hands together gleefully going, oh, here we go. Josh is going to sink his teeth into her. This is going to be a bloodbath. But no, it's not going to be. I'm sorry to disappoint everyone. This is very much so just a bit of back and forth on the positives and negatives of what could come with World of Warcraft. So obviously it's interesting to hear that you did get some negative receptions on Twitter, and obviously people, gamers doing what they do. They'll voice their opinions on social media if they feel differently, particularly about something like Classic, where we're very passionate. But you raised the point, and you really seem to come across from a loving stance nonetheless with WoW Classic, in that you will still be playing the game. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as soon as it was announced as a done deal, I was certainly both nervous and excited for it. I have such powerful memories of World of Warcraft's early days, which I relate in that article. It's one of the rare, truly personal pieces that I write. And I love the game. And I'm very excited to play it, to experience that again, because that's one of the things about MMOs is that, when they change, you really can't go back to the way things were. And so this is going to be a rather interesting and unique experience, I think.
Absolutely. Now, keeping that sort of preface in mind, so you'll be there with us, you'll be diving in, leveling a character, sort of wanting to fall in love with the world all over again. But I'll turn to a few points from your article where you suggest that perhaps it may not be all it's cracked up to be once we start getting involved with World of Warcraft Classic. And I guess the first point I really want to address, which is something that has come up so much in the, 1 year since the project's announcement, from people who aren't as enthused about Classic, and that's the point of nostalgia. And people say it is nostalgia. You take off those rose-tinted glasses, you fools. You have no idea what you're signing up for. You think this game is amazing, but it's not. It's 14 years old. Things have changed. The market has changed. MMOs have changed. Stop being ridiculous. Now, an interesting point came up that I wanted to run by you on the WoW Classic subreddit recently, where a user posted that they were getting fed up with people, and I'm not saying this is you by any means, but this is other people who have been using the term. They say, they're getting fed up with people sort of somewhat getting, the term nostalgia wrong. And they're saying everyone who seems to be anti-classic is saying nostalgia, but they're interpreting that as being nostalgic, that something is not as good as you thought it was. However, obviously when we talk about nostalgia, it's more a warm and fuzzy feeling about times that were. So do you think that we are deeply rooted in nostalgia, and that in thinking of what the times were, we'll still be disappointed?
I think that that's a useful distinction, certainly. And it's the one that I really was working with in the article, because I have nostalgia for, WoW Vanilla. It's that the point that I was making was not necessarily that those are incorrect or bad feelings, but that rather the feelings are informed by certain things that cannot necessarily be recreated in the present. And one has to be clear with oneself about what it is that they're trying to get out of the game. So I received some responses that were like very much in that same vein, right? I'm not nostalgic. I know I'll never have my old friends or my old guild or whatever. I'm looking forward to creating new experiences in this same old environment. And I think that that's actually a healthier perspective to take, but to remember that a lot of what was informing your positive feelings is intimately tied to a range of social connections and life conditions that Blizzard simply cannot recreate. Azeroth is a setting, and it was a setting for a certain phase of our lives from 2004 to 2007, and that involved being with certain people, being with certain social units, being at a certain stage of our personal developments. All of those things influence the feelings that we took to the game. Then I know that when I log back in, I'm going to have some very powerful emotions, like seeing Alberdine again, for example, right? That's going to be incredible. Mm-hmm. Or actually, re-experiencing the run-up to opening AQ. That's going to be very cool. But it's also going to be extraordinarily different. I'm a totally different person than I was in many ways since, I was first doing this stuff back in 2005, 2006. And I also am not going to be there with the people who made it special to me at the time, because so many of my memories of WoW are memories of people that I talk to, like, role-playing or staying up chatting, hanging out in one of the houses in Stormwind while the sun slowly came up over the canals, right? Those are things I know I can never quite get back, even if the servers come back online. So that's more what I was suggesting, is that you have to be clear on what WoW Classic can bring back to you and what it's impossible to bring back. And if you are going in clear-eyed thinking, I want to use this setting for completely new adventures, for a completely, to make totally new memories here and free myself from that past, then yeah, I think that's a healthier approach to take. But all I was saying is you have to be clear about that and to recognize what it is you're nostalgic for.
Oh, I completely appreciate that, and I think that is the right distinction to make in terms of what we talk about when we bring up that term nostalgia. And let me get this straight with everyone. I 100% agree with you, and for everyone to know, there's no way, as you say, I'm going back to that time. I'm not dating the same person. I'm not living in the same house. I'm not at university anymore, trudging my way through law school. I will absolutely be coming at it from a different angle. But again, to your credit, as you raise in the article, and again that you've extrapolated on here, it's not like we can't make new experiences. I'm very much so looking forward to getting WoW Classic introduced into my life now, where I might arguably have a little bit more time to devote to it. I was a casual player back in the day. As I said, I was going through law school. I could only play so much WoW per week. And it's something that now, even though, yes, the full-time job, blah, 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 I'm looking forward to really throwing myself more into the game. And I've already made new friends via the podcast, which I can't wait to play the game with. And it will basically be, situation A and situation B. And I think that I am one of those people who's just as excited to play the game again in these new circumstances. But I'd ask you this, and again, just to push back a little bit on the nostalgia point, and I'd be intrigued just to hear sort of, are you looking forward to creating those new experiences yourself? I know you're saying you're playing the game, but are you of the mindset that where you are at life now, where you're at with life now, might not make the game as enjoyable?
That is a real possibility. I'm fully prepared for that. I know that there are a number of things that might make it less enjoyable. I mean, as I'm sure you and your listeners are probably tired of hearing about, like so many of the quality of life improvements that have come to define not just WoW, but all MMOs since then, will be absent. We're going to have to get ready to for the priest to cast a prayer of fortitude on everybody individually and have a drink of water after every cast, right? Like, it's going to be a lot of that sort of stuff where we're going to go, oh yeah, right, we had to do this crap, and I hope that doesn't leave us dispirited, but I think that that's also the other component of the nostalgia piece, is that it's one of the beautiful things about human memory, is that over time we can emphasize the good in our past and leave aside the detritus. But now we're going right back into the thick of it, and we're going to have to renegotiate some of these bits of tedium and difficulty. The other thing, though, that I am excited about on the other side of things is that, like you, I was a much more casual player back then. Even though I have a lot less time now, there's a certain aspect of being so much more familiar with the world that allows me to come into WoW Classic with a different mindset that may enable me to, actually do more regularly scheduled raiding. I raided very sporadically in vanilla, and so I got to experience some of that, but not with, regularity, not, in a proper raiding guild or using DKP. I certainly didn't win anything, right? Maybe that'll be different this time around, and I can actually participate in some of these big experiences that I missed when vanilla was actually live. So, I'm going in thinking, well, if I'm going to have fun here, it will be to do everything that I couldn't do, I didn't know how to do. And I also, however, on that note, miss that sense of wonder where that definitely can't be recreated. The sense of, you're going in there for the first time, you don't know what's out there in this vast world. You open up the map of Azeroth and you see this huge universe waiting to be explored. I now know what's, in Ungoro Crater or in Feralas or in Stranglethorn Vale. And
yes, people looking to gank you. That's what's there.
Oh yes, that's going to be quite interesting, isn't it? Yeah, that might be fun, right? That there will now be actual world PvP in Stranglethorn Vale again. Like that could be interesting.
Well, one of the things, and it's something that I've raised several times on the show before, is I stupidly or not stupidly refer to it as a sliding doors moment where, we all get to be Gwyneth Paltrow again now, and we get to go back and do things differently. So you get to do the things that you didn't do before, as you've explained. Now, in hearing you talk about that, I honestly, Katherine, I have to admit, I can't pick whether or not you're actually excited to get that opportunity to do things differently. Does it entice you? Are you sort of titillated by, I get to do something different now?
Oh yeah, I am quite excited to actually try that, There were a couple of places that I didn't really get to go, like raiding Naxxramas. That just when that debuted, I was not able to actually join a raiding group, and it was so far along the progression line that it's obviously much harder to pug at level. So, and indeed pugging raids in general was a horrible idea even at the start of the, raiding chain. So it was much harder to get into something like that. Whereas now I feel like, well, there's a real possibility that I could actually be a holy priest healing in these spaces, and it'd be great. That's something that I'm definitely looking forward to. And I'm also looking forward to trying new classes and specs, because I was pretty devoted to Holy Priest in vanilla, and I didn't roll other classes until at least midway through Burning Crusade. So it'd be interesting to actually have the experience of being a paladin in vanilla or trying druid in vanilla. So I'm definitely looking forward to that. But the big question mark is, what will the social experiences be? So I know also that there are some role players that are excited about the prospect of having the old world back without any of the, the controversies around like phasing, for instance, that have plagued the RP community in recent iterations of WoW, and to have these spaces back that now we can play in once again. And if I find people willing to actually share in those adventures once more, that could make or break the experience for me. So I'm excited. I'm just, trying to be analytical about it, be a bit philosophical about it.
No, absolutely. I appreciate it for sure. Well, just a couple more things to push on the nostalgia point. And one of the things that people bring up very often, and it's absolutely the fact that this is true. People say, well, you can't say it's nostalgia because we all play on private servers, and we've been playing private servers for years, and we've been loving it. So people say, look, it's unfortunately there are dirty, dark corners of the internet that sometimes we don't talk about, where people can still play this iteration of the game, and they have been doing so for years. So people say, oh, it's nostalgia. You don't remember what it was like like, so you don't know what you're talking about. And they're like, well, I do remember because I've been doing it for the last 3 or 4 years and I've been rolling on new servers all the time and I still love it. Now, I say that's absolutely the case, but it will probably be somewhat of a minority of the player base that checks out Classic, is the ones who have come from private servers. Do you feel that, well, what would you have to say to those people who push back with you and go, Katherine, please, I know it's not nostalgia because I love it and I'm still playing it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was another point that I heard from a few people was, well, Katherine, how can you say this when, there is a community around these private servers, right? And there are a couple of things that I would say to that. One is that one of the distinguishing features of the private servers is that they often tweak the game to one degree or another. Mm-hmm. There are a number of private servers that are not for vanilla, but for different expansions. Mm-hmm. So there are private servers for Wrath and for Pandaria and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But also that they have other tweaks like more experience, more gold, things that make the experience a bit more convenient in ways that, Blizzard never would.
Let's say we're talking about the ones that are, say, a 1-to-1 copy of what vanilla was.
Yes. So why would those people pick up sticks from those servers where they already have established characters and community and try to transfer that to the official WoW Classic server? Now you might say, well, safety and security, right? They go there, they know it's sanctioned by Blizzard, but it's still a big move, right? Mm-hmm. And also, a lot of these servers don't necessarily have long lifespans, which is, like if they get shut down, then yeah, maybe they might want to move to WoW Classic and, because they have to start over anyway. But the point about the lifespans, which touches on something that I actually would like to get into with you, mm-hmm. in our discussion, is about, player retention.
Yes, absolutely.
Right? That is, I think, a critical issue.
It's a huge thing. It's something you raised multiple times in your article, which I definitely wanted to talk about. Sort of, even if people overcome this issue of nostalgia, then what are we really going to talk about with Classic being a financial success in terms of player retention? And you do go into, when there is a finite amount of content, how can we realistically expect this game to be successful? And I absolutely appreciate that point. A lot of people have brought that up. I guess one thing I would say is, in terms of player retention, one point to sort of kick you off is on the private server things, if I argue against myself for a second, is, it's come out, there was an article I think yesterday released with a chat with private server people, the organizers of a certain private server, who have said, we have no plans of going anywhere upon Classic's release. And that was a point of conjecture within the community, saying, well, are these people going to pack up shop and go home once Classic is out? Is there no more private servers? And one well-known private server has said, oh, no, we're sticking around. We're still going to be there as an option. And some people have sort of, it's divided the community a bit on how they feel about that. And, the legalities are another thing. But one point that we haven't raised yet that's in the private servers camps is, they're free. So there are always going to be a proportion of people who are like, I can play this game for free. Why would I play Blizzard for it? So to sort of kick you off, I guess that's one reason why player retention might be a problem with Classic. What else do you say, obviously, might be issues with player retention?
Well, that's the other point, is that these games depend on persistent communities. That is what makes MMOs distinctive, is that they are always online. And indeed, that's becoming less and less distinct as gaming technology changes. But historically, that was their value add. They're always there. You don't have to save the game. And there are always other people waiting and ready to play with you. And you have to keep those people logging in. You have to keep them coming back. You have to keep them paying. And you do that by releasing a steady stream of new content and expansions. World of Warcraft was designed from the ground up with that expectation. Burning Crusade was not a surprise. It was not something they did suddenly. It was always part of the master plan that would have been abandoned only if, the game had bombed, essentially. But the other point that I would quickly make here is about, Blizzard's financials. My point is not about whether or not Blizzard will make money off of this. I would be surprised if they were expecting to. They're completely fine. this is a bolt-on to the existing WoW subscription.
Oh yeah, they're not sitting around with the hat out on the street going, change please.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're doing quite well for themselves with all of their other properties, to the point where, you know, without wanting to compliment Blizzard too much on this is practically a giveaway in relative terms. But yes, compared to existing private servers, you still have to pay if you're not currently subscribed to WoW. It's not Blizzard's financial success I'm concerned about, it's the cultural success of the game. Because in order for it to be interesting, in order for it to attract people, a critical mass of people, to keep coming back, there has to be something that compels them to log in day after day, week after week. And for the opening year or so, you'll see a bit of that because Blizzard's planning to sort of recreate the staged release of new raid content, like the opening of AQ and Nax and so forth. So that's not going to be in the game straight away, and that'll be something to look forward to, right? Then those patches will be released and everyone will rush to the servers, you know, they'll want to be the first to ring the gong, and that'll be great. But you're going to reach a point eventually where you run out of vanilla content, where it's over. And what do you do then? Right? Well, people will, you know, a hardcore of people, I predict, will go through all the raid content. Everyone will get outfitted with their Thunder Furies and Atishus eventually. And then there will be no worlds left to conquer. Historically, MMOs take care of that by saying, and now here's an expansion, right? Start all over again, start the raid cycle again. And by definition, WoW Classic can't exactly do that unless they decide somewhere down the road, we're just going to restart the clock. So 2021, Burning Crusade is back, right?
Yep, that's a possibility for sure.
Like, if that does happen, then I will happily eat my criticisms. But then also, does that then appeal to the people who wanted specifically the vanilla experience?
Yes.
Because that's a big part of the community here, that vanilla was this ideal, that this was the unadulterated World of Warcraft. So if you start bolting expansions back on, even, you know, several years apart, are you ultimately then debauching the very experience you were selling to people as, here's the reason we're creating WoW Classic? So that's the conflict there. And I think that if you do keep it just vanilla for all eternity, you're not going to have people logging in after a while. Not many people at the end of the day. These smaller private servers, which can be very fly-by-night and can get shut down for legal reasons, they have people sticking around for a few months, maybe a couple years at most, and then, you know, the problem's solved for them when the server gets shut down. But if this is an official server that's going to remain open in perpetuity, supposedly, then what do you do when there are no worlds left to conquer? As I said, if you can't keep people logging back in, then that's going to make it harder for anyone else to get interested in the game, because that's really why you're there, is to play with other people. And especially in vanilla, where so much more of the content is heavily group dependent. Like, over the years, Blizzard has tried to get around, you know, population fluctuation by making more soloable content, and with, you know, all the cross-realm stuff, right? So better resourcing of what they've got. But that's not going to be an option in WoW Classic if you're going to preserve the Classic experience, right? You can't have soloable dungeons. You can't have lower difficulty levels. The Classic experience is about, you need 5 good people to do Scholomance or Strat, right? To do a Baron run. That's the experience that people want, and rightly so, if that's what you're after. I mean, I myself am looking forward to recreating that sense, but then you need people. You need people in the LFG chat. You need people just standing around, nothing to do, in Stormwind and Orgrimmar waiting for something to happen, right? And I don't know if you can get there if the game is fundamentally going to be static. I don't know if Blizzard means for this to be like, you know, a once-in-a-lifetime event that happens for a year, maybe 2 years, and then that's it. But I think that that's not really what a lot of the people who are excited about Classic are after.
Now, you mentioned the culture of Classic, and as you just described, you know, things like standing around waiting to form a group for perhaps a couple of hours going, oh God, where will we get this 4th or 5th person, blah, blah, blah. Now, do you feel that that's something that might, we talk about the concept of tedium, and people say Classic wasn't difficult. It was tedious. It was designed differently. MMOs have evolved over time. We're in a different headspace now as gamers. We want things easy. We want gratification. We don't want to go about things the arduous way. Now, some people are arguing, let's say, forget the looking for a group thing and sitting around for hours in trade chat or whatever, general chat going, someone want to come to Scholarman's with me? Let's say the gameplay in general, it's a bit more of a grindy game. Things take a little bit longer in Classic, but some people do love it that way. And do you think that in 2018 there is any argument whatsoever, and this has come up at some portions of people's arguments, saying, hey, maybe we're going to get somewhat of a retro revival for old school MMO values. Hey man, retro gaming's coming back into effect. Look at, I cite things like, you've got Shovel Knight, a great, callback to the past that did so well. You've got things like, maybe not perhaps as much in the same vein, but, Super Meat Boy, a old school difficult sort of platformer with a little bit of a twist. Dark Souls, one of the most difficult games out there. People loved it because they got, a kick out of a video game being hard again. Or perhaps, I don't know, tedious or something that you had to really pay attention to. So do you think there's any argument at all for, hey, maybe retail players, as we say, modern World of Warcraft players, will come and check out Classic, having not experienced what Classic's like before, and say, I kind of like being pushed like this?
I think that it's a possibility. Although I would also say something like Dark Souls is just genuinely difficult in a mechanical way. Yeah. Right. It's less about,
it's not so
you're
much
being
tedium,
forced to,
no.
Right. You really do have to be on your best with that kind of a game. The other thing I would say too about these sorts of retro comebacks is that I guess having been so immersed in the MMO space for so long, I'm a little skeptical of that because, look at Vanguard, right? The whole point of that is this is the spiritual successor to EverQuest. And look where that ended up, right? The whole point of Vanguard was precisely that, a brand new game that did not have even the innovations of WoW Vanilla. So there were no instanced dungeons in that game, for instance. It was meant to recall the atmosphere, the way of life of the original EverQuest, and it was, Brad McQuaid overseeing everything, his final vision, the spiritual successor to his greatest masterpiece, blah, 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 right? And that didn't go so well. And part of that was due to a bad development cycle and being pushed around by Microsoft. There's a whole story there. You could argue that under more propitious circumstances, maybe it would have succeeded. But I also think that the population that would be interested in persisting in that kind of space, that's always the critical distinction with MMOs, is wanting to stick around for a very long time. Because when you look at the retro revival stuff, a lot of it is single player or small group that's not meant to occupy your time for months and months on end, right? And where you have much more control over how much time you spend with it in already a narrowly circumscribed way. Whereas an MMO is open-ended and rewards spending lots and lots of time consecutively with it. So you have to entice people to do that, to want to do that constantly. And I'm skeptical that a retro revival experience could do that. I could be wrong, right? We are in a very different space than we were in 2007, for sure. When Vanguard was released, we were in a very different gaming culture than we are now. There may well be a bigger market available for something like that, but I would be skeptical that the numbers would be huge enough to sustain it. But look, again, I'd be happy to be wrong.
One thing that comes up, I don't believe this point specifically came up in your article, but we've sort of lightly danced around it just then in terms of retro gaming. And one point that, I love to lean on because I'm a brute with no other points than this one when I hear people say, oh, the whole point of video games is to move forward. It's an evolving industry. We are pushing to get to the next stage of gaming. What's next? Let's get bigger and better. Why do you want to, play WoW Classic and take a step 14 years back? We've changed, man. And my comeback is always, all right, well, do you ever have moments on a rainy day where you pick up a beloved game from the past and say, you know what? Screw it. I'm playing through A Link to the Past today because I love that game. And they might say, yes. And I'll say, well, and they'll go, oh no, that's different, So I guess I'd put it to you, do you actively revisit old favorites? And do you see any difference between that and people being interested in WoW Classic?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think of The Elder Scrolls Morrowind, right, which is one of my favorite games of all time, or Knights of the Old Republic. These are games that are now intensely dated in some ways, and yet still play brilliantly and remain sublime experiences. And so I don't think that there's anything wrong with that. And I also would add to your point that the sense that the only good things are new things is certainly very toxic in the gaming space, because a lot gets lost in that push for bigger, better, faster. It becomes very homogenizing. It's why Ubisoft game is a genre unto itself, right? When it really shouldn't be. Like that troubles me. And so I think that that's the upside of nostalgia among video game players, is that it can sometimes push people to say, hey, let's revisit what was best about these older titles that have been lost in the push for greater efficiency or better graphics, right? Like the latter especially. There's so many good games out there that have fantastic storylines or gameplay that are fully immersive experiences that they don't have cutting edge graphics, like Return of the Obra Dinn, brilliant indie game by the same fellow who made Papers, Please. It uses graphics that would not be out of place on, like an Apple IIe or something. And that you could say that that's, just retro fetishism, but I think it also does something positive for the game in a lot of ways by emphasizing the clues that you have to look at in order to progress. And I think that there's something to be said for the merits of the scope of WoW in its original form. That indeed a lot was lost in the push towards convenience. My friend Christos Reed, when he wrote about WoW Classic for Rock Paper Shotgun, talked about how not having quest markers meant you actually had to pay attention to the text for a quest, to actually pay attention, like, go north and then go west along this road after this landmark. That's really freaking cool. And I realize that's also what I love about Morrowind, is that you had a physical map, not just in the game, but an actual fold-out map, which I still have hung on my wall, and you could see every little detail, the little roads, the little caves, unmarked, just, a little dot on the map. And if you paid attention to what, the NPCs and the quest givers were telling you, you could find your way. And that was fun. And there's something that got lost in, like, Skyrim and other games of that nature, where now it's just a marker on a map, right? And that, yes, it's convenient for 1,001 reasons, but there's a bit of magic that gets lost. And I think that it's true to say that vanilla had some of that fairy dust that, has now since been blown away because of some of the quality of life changes. And this is a very long way of me saying that I think there is merit to trying to reclaim some of this. I don't think it's so different from, my desire to revisit, say, KOTOR 2. I don't think it's all that different from that at all. And I certainly don't think that one is superior to the other. It's just that what I keep coming back to is the nature of MMOs, right? Because, like, Morrowind will always be out there. You can still get it relatively easily. It doesn't depend on 100,000 people being logged into it at the same time for a protracted period. But an MMO does. And that's what makes me a bit worried. Because like, say, like Classic just devolves into having like a community similar to some of the, you know, quote unquote illegal private servers, 500 to 1,000 people. Most of these folks know each other. They form a very tightly knit community. Maybe they start gatekeeping. Maybe they start making it harder for outsiders to come in, right? And that's whether they do that intentionally or not. And that would mean that the game is not as healthy as it could be. It means that there won't be as many people to experience it with. Like, there was something beautiful about Stormwind or Orgrimmar being like, you know, New York City or Sydney, right? You'd just be surrounded by millions of people. It felt like you didn't know any of them. You could always run into someone different. And if you had problems with one group, you could go somewhere else and you'd be like a million miles away socially. But if it becomes a small town atmosphere, that changes, and that changes the character of the game entirely in ways that I don't know if people are accounting for as well as they could be. So, I'm sorry, I know there was an essay of an answer, but it's the best way. It's the best way I can answer that, is to say, like, we keep coming back to the fact that an MMO has particular social needs, and that's what makes me worried.
I appreciate that. I guess one quick follow-up question from that is, when you talk about quality of life changes, is there any small part of you, and obviously everything has its pros and cons, and the argument, the knee-jerk argument against, oh, you won't have the quality of life things that we have now in Classic. Sorry, well, when you're playing Classic, you won't have the quality of life features that we enjoy now in modern World of Warcraft. And people obviously say, well, sure, they might make your life easier, but there are also detriments to those arguments in terms of, you know, the LFG tool. Well, you run a dungeon now and no one talks to each other. It removes the community aspect. And then people say, you've got all your flying mounts, and how good was it when you had to walk everywhere and you saw this lovely immersive, worlds, and you actually had to take your time to go somewhere, and it felt like you were actually traversing a continent as opposed to getting everywhere in 3 seconds. Is there a small part of you that might like some of those quality of life changes being taken away from you?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, during that whole spiel, like about the quest markers, for example, that there is something to be said for having to pay attention, right? And to actually try to navigate the world in a way that makes it feel immersive and authentic, as if I'm actually trying to, as you say, traverse this continent, looking for landmarks, looking for the turn off the path, etc.
Or looking for Mancrick's wife.
Yes, you know, like that's great. And to some of the other ones that you pointed out, look, Blizzard frankly admitted that the way they implemented flying mounts was not great at the end of the day, right? That's why we have like the, you know, laborious Pathfinder achievements now, because they want to force you to actually experience this world that, you know, their designers have spent months and years of their lives putting together for you. And I do think that there's something to be said for the vastness of World of Warcraft prior to having flying mounts rather, that is worth preserving. I am actually excited to see how some of these things feel. I already mentioned like some quality of life issues that I'm not going to be so happy about, like having to, you know, drink every time I cast Prayer of Fortitude, or having to send, you know, 10 mails to send 10 attachments to the same person. I don't know exactly where some of those improvements came in, but I don't think it was at this point in vanilla. I might be wrong.
I think the mail thing was, I think they addressed that at BlizzCon, and they might have said that they're tweaking the mail thing. But apart from that, yes, a lot of the old features will still be there with the drinking and whatnot. They're not fixing any of that.
So like that sort of stuff will just be irritating. But some of the other quality of life changes not being there will be, I think, quite compelling to experience again in a good way. So yeah, it's really a question of like, what quality of life changes are we talking about? And my answer is some of them might be interesting to have removed. Others I'm definitely going to miss.
Now, Katherine, thank you so much for all of this. You've been fantastic. I just wanted to go out on this note. As I said at the start of the call, I don't want people to think, this is all doom and gloom. It was important to obviously hear an informed argument for why we might need to take a step back and actually, critically analyze whether or not Classic would be a success or, retain its players as you've put forward. But I think, if people are a bit bummed out, not that they should be after this call, again, reinforcing, it's not like you're not excited for Classic. You will be playing and you're pumped up to get back to this world. If I can just delve into, do you have plans? Do you know what you're going to be rolling? What do you want to do specifically?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I have some ideas. I don't know if I have firm plans yet. I know I've got some friends who are interested in going back, and I will probably join them as soon as it goes live, provided that, because I'm working on my PhD now, so my time is a bit wibbly. But if I do have time right when it launches, I will definitely want to be there with them. What I will roll, I'm tempted to recreate my first successful WoW character, who was a holy priestess of Elune, but also interested in maybe rolling a human paladin and seeing what that experience is like in this iteration of the game, because I didn't roll my human paladin until like late Wrath of the Lich King, so obviously that was a totally different experience. And I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to doing things like actually role-playing dungeon runs, which I did with my guilds back when we were farming tier 0 equipment. Oh goodness. I'm looking forward to tier 0. I will say that. That was so much fun to actually acquire all of those little pieces. You really felt this profound sense of accomplishment getting them. And most of them were so well designed visually. I want to do that again. And I'm also kind of looking forward to the experience of being an enchantress again, who is just hawking her wares in trade chat. There's so many things that would change to make these professions a little easier and to make them, auction house viable, which is understandable. But I really miss that experience of, my night elf just sitting on the trade house steps in Stormwind and then just opening up her enchanting emporium and actually interacting with people and receiving tips and her RPing the experience. Like there was a joy to that made it feel like this is what an MMO is supposed to be. I want to see if I can recreate that sense. That's sort of what I'm looking forward to, but also just re-immersing myself in the world. I want to run around and actually feel again. Like I keep going back to Alberdine because I just love it so much. Night Elf forever, yada, yada, yada. But also to do things that I didn't get to do the first time around because I didn't have time, like actually try to participate in the AQ event. That's going to be fun to experience. I am not doubting that at all. As long as we have a critical mass of people, that's going to be incredible to experience in a vanilla context. So I'm looking forward to that too. I just want to revisit some of those old ghosts, and bearing in mind all of my own critiques, nevertheless, I want to actually re-immerse myself in that place I left behind so many years ago.
Absolutely. I very much so feel the same way. Well, look, Katherine, I can't thank you enough again for coming on the show. Now, please do tell people, where can they find you and your work online?
You can find my Twitter. I'm not sure how much it would be appreciated, but at Quinnae_moon, which is QUINNAE_moon, like the celestial object. And fun trivia fact, that is named after Quinnae Moongazer, my first World of Warcraft character. And you can also find my work on Gamasutra, where I have a bi-monthly column about all matters relating to video gaming and gaming culture. So I'm about, and also I write for The Verge periodically, although they're much more about technology and society more widely, though I do occasionally do some stuff about gaming for The Verge too. So yes, you can find me online.
Fantastic. Well, look, Katherine Cross, everybody. Thank you so much again, Katherine. If I can say, it's been a delight talking to you. Ish Nuala, best of luck to you in the future. And I do hope to, maybe we'll touch base again once Classic, drops, and we'll find out how you're enjoying it.
Yes, I would love to come back and give my thoughts on it once it goes live. By the light of the moon.
Thanks so much, Katherine. We'll talk to you later.
Take care.
Hi everyone, Josh here. I just want to take a quick moment to remind you that while Countdown to Classic will always be a podcast you can get for free, if you do happen to really enjoy the show and find yourself always coming back for more, then please do check out the show's Patreon page to see how you can help keep the lights on at Countdown to Classic, and even vote on show content as the show continues to bring you more and more classic WoW goodness. Alternatively, if monthly subscriptions aren't your thing, you can always visit the show's tip jar over at Ko-Fi, with that link being in the show notes and on the website too. Now, let's get back to the show. Hi everyone. Before we dive into the next few calls, I just want to throw out the following preface. The next 90 minutes of the show discusses some relatively heavy topics, being gaming addiction and depression. There are brief references made to drug use, suicide, and addiction treatment in general. So if this is something that you shouldn't be hearing, then please feel free to cut forward in time to this episode's chat on spellbatching after this segment. You'll find the timestamp in the show notes. And with that, we'll start these calls. Okay, we've got another Countdown to Classic listener on the line, and this is a call that I'm really, really excited to get stuck into, and I want to throw out a huge Countdown to Classic welcome to listener Jamie. Jamie, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks, Josh. I'm happy to be here.
It's so great to have you, and what we're going to be getting into is a very, very important topic, and it's something that I've been meaning to dive back into on the show for some time. And just to give a bit of a preamble here, and for your own benefit, Jamie, the show has touched on, so we're diving into sort of addiction and mental health issues as well within the realm of World of Warcraft and gaming in general. And Jamie, you're on the show, as we'll get into in a second, because of your expertise in the area, your work in the area. And I've been tearing through a number of articles that you publish on a regular basis on this very topic, and they've been fantastic to get through. And it's something that really, I must admit, I have such little experience with, and such a, empty knowledge base on, and I'm hungry to learn more and more. And it's really, I was going from link to link to article, really, really enjoying your writing. And as I said on the show, we've covered it before, and it got such a positive reception that I was a little bit surprised by. I thought people might be like, oh, why is Josh talking about this on his World of Warcraft podcast? We want to talk about, Scarlet Monastery and talent points and things. And when I talked about this topic and went a little bit off-piste, if you will, the wave of positive reception was really surprising, and people were saying more. We want more of it. So here we are today. Now, Jamie, what I'll get you to do is just explain to people your background in this area, a little bit about your personal experience, a little about your work experience. Tell us about Jamie.
Okay, so I have a pretty deep and wide history in both of these topics of addiction, depression, mental health, all these things, and World of Warcraft. It kind of touches all of those things in my life. So I have a lot to say on the topic, but so as far as my professional experience, I've been working at a substance abuse treatment center for about 2 years now. So we treat drug addiction and alcohol addiction. So not that WoW addiction is not real, but I guess a serious version of that, where it's a chemical thing where people are being treated for something that I don't want to get too much into that part of it yet, but
okay.
So, but yeah, I work at a treatment center, and I mostly write articles that kind of educate people about addiction, and it's kind of encouragement to get people to seek help for themselves, because it is a disease that you need to kind of self-identify, and people can't make the decision for you. So
it's really two topics that we want to cover here, and it's the realm of addiction and also later on, depression and mental health related issues. So if you're happy to dive into both of those, we might separate the two. And
Yeah.
I just wanted to kick off with addiction because that's the topic that I just finished off reading about and is relatively still fresh in my mind. So as you said, you work at an addiction treatment center. That's a field of expertise for you. And as you mentioned, look, we absolutely realize that when people generally talk addiction or addicts, we are talking about things like narcotics and whatnot. And, you know, it's a very, I guess I'd ask you in terms of what similarities in treatment are there between something like a gaming addiction versus a narcotics addiction? And we understand that they're separate but similarly important issues to address.
It's kind of an interesting question because we actually have kind of a full spectrum of care at the facility that I work at, which is not true of all substance abuse centers. So we start at detox, which is where, you know, people who are heavily dependent on opiates or benzos or alcohol, particularly the last two, because they can actually be fatal if you go through withdrawals without the assistance of medication. Whereas like if you're having a game addiction or whatever, like there's no real period of withdrawal that you need to worry about that like you're going to die or whatever. But it can still be serious in the fact that so after you go through detox, you go through ideally, you know, in an ideal world where you can devote all of this time to treatment, you would go to like a 30 to 90 day program of inpatient where you're living at the facility and having like daily groups and individual therapy, like a mixture of the two that address different types of both interpersonal therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And we have several modalities that are kind of specialized to addiction. One of them's called like the matrix model, whatever. And we have done some kind of networking with different gaming addiction treatment facilities, which are kind of popping up now.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, so you go from detox to residential and then outpatient, which is where you're starting to get integrated back into the world and you can go back to work and you can, usually it starts at like 6 days a week and then it titrates down to, you know, 5 days, 3 days, whatever. And you just progressively go to a point where you eventually get into sober living, which is kind of where you're kind of like at a more functional point in your life again. And so the video game addiction places typically will start at the second stage. Like they don't, like I said, they don't have that detox because you just don't need it.
All right. Well, if I can kick off from there with the question of your experiences, have you come across anyone in your life or come across any particular stories through other people of someone who is really entrenched in video game addiction, or is it something that you've experienced at all in your life?
That's a really interesting question. So that kind of ties into the depression part of my story. I actually have a pretty intense personal history with like the guy who introduced me into World of Warcraft.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, like I said, addiction is a self-diagnosed disease, and so I can't like retroactively say that he was a video game addict because like it's something that you need to decide for yourself. But I would definitely say that he wasn't working, and at some point in our relationship, like he was playing between 12 to 16 hours a day, and like that was pretty much daily. And like that's kind of how I was introduced to the game, is in a kind of an unhealthy way. That you know, it was fun, but it's also not really the way that normal people play World of Warcraft. So.
Right. So when you say you were introduced in that way, and again, we've spoken briefly before we started this call that obviously some personal details and stories of yours might come out, but I've said obviously don't tell us anything that you're not comfortable with sharing. But if you don't mind, if I chase that up a little bit, if we can flesh out the details of how you were introduced to the game and this situation where you say, you know, maybe even though it's self-diagnosed, this person who introduced you could well be termed an addict. I'm not sure, but what kind of gameplay was going on in the house when you were introduced to it?
Yeah, so I was not paying that much attention to how many games he was playing because I was under the impression that he was like more of a normal person when we first started living together and stuff. But, so when I was introduced to the game, like we took like a deep dive really quickly. So at that point, like, I mean, it's hard for me to say like how quickly I started playing that much a day. Like I would probably say like close to 8 hours or so. I don't know. But so the context of me being introduced to the game and the only reason that he kind of roped me into it is because right before he had met me, he had been involved in arenas. Like, so I went into the game around like Wrath of the Lich King.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't play vanilla. Like, sorry guys. But so he had been selling arena teams to people on our server, which is like, I guess at the time you could, like the only way that you could get really good PvP gear was to have a high arena rating. Mm-hmm. So in order to get that, you had to actually like go through all these matches and win at like really high skill levels. And so the whole point of having me into it is like he had lost his arena partner. And so he wanted me to basically replace them and be his healer. So.
Okay. So you're plugging away doing your 8 hours per day. Did it grow from there, or did it kind of stay static around that much time per day? And how long were you maintaining that 8 hours a day gameplay over a matter of months, years? What happened there?
So I was living with him for, I would say like a year and a half, 2 years. Actually, no, I lived there for 2 years, but, sorry, this was so long ago. This was like 2009.
Okay.
I did live there for 2 years, and I think we started the game like probably 6 months after I started living there. So I guess a year and a half. So like it did fluctuate. I would say we played anywhere from, like I said, 8 hours to, I mean, I would be just playing with him. So like up to 16, I guess, maybe actually sometimes we would play more because we would, you know, get into like taking caffeine and all that kind of stuff. So like, sorry, we actually started taking like real drugs. So I don't really want to get into this part of it.
Sure, I understand.
Yeah. So it was getting really intense. We were taking like amphetamines and stuff, and we would go, into the point where like we would go for like over 24 hours playing arenas. So this was like probably one of the darkest points of my life.
I understand.
Yeah.
Well, just to get into the technicalities of addiction and sort of more into the theory of it, mm-hmm. I was doing some more reading outside of your articles as well, and it's something that has become a little bit of a hot topic recently. Now, you might know more about this than I do, but I was trying to figure out sort of, you know, what not only the medical society, but also, you know, so people involved in medicine or treatment think of it as much as gamers do. And I found an article that I thought summarized perhaps a few general feelings about gaming addiction that I wanted to run by you. And there was a New York Post article from 2016 by a Dr. Nicholas Kardaras who basically said the following, and this one has been a little bit debunked since then, but they went a bit sensationalist and basically described video gaming as a digital heroin, as they say, you know, how these screens are turning kids into psychotic junkies. And I just want to read you a little bit from this article that I read. We now know that those iPads, smartphones and Xboxes are a form of digital drug. Recent brain imaging research is showing that they affect the brain's frontal cortex, which controls executive functioning, including impulse control, in exactly the same way that cocaine does. So they're saying basically that's right, your kid's brain when playing Minecraft looks like a brain on drugs. Now that's been debunked, as I said, since people have come out, and the article I've said has gone, that's complete and utter nonsense. You know, if they did their research, they would know that what actually happens to the brain when people video game, and that's the following. They said that yes, it does have an effect on the game, on the brain, because, you know, they said that dopamine obviously kicks into the neurotransmitter when we're playing video games, and drugs do the same way. They operate, you know, filtering things down the same pathways. However, that's something that happens whenever we do anything pleasurable. So it's a bit of a, you know, sensationalist hot take, if you will, because the article goes on to say that if you ate a slice of pepperoni pizza or some ice cream, you literally, the brain does the same thing. So I guess my question for you will be, when you see some of the sensationalist attitudes that we see in popular media regarding gaming addiction, how does that make you feel? Do you think a lot of it is horseshit?
Well, I mean, I kind of just shared like how bad our like version of gaming addiction got at that point in my life. So, my opinion on it is kind of just like the way that people play games is not really like an addiction in itself. It's more just like kind of a reflection of where you are in your life, and what's going on. So it's not really a cause. It's more of a symptom, you know? So it's interesting that like you talk about how like dopamine it affects all of those things, and how there are like all of these different studies that try to track how much, video games can actually constitute an intoxicant. because there are a lot of different, I guess you couldn't even call them theories at this point. They'd just be hypotheses. And this kind of gets into, I guess, the most scientific answer to this question of whether, gaming addiction is an addiction or not.
Yes.
So it kind of depends on who you ask. So like, there are all these articles that you're talking about that are sensationalist that like make you laugh, whatever, but these are just like randos that are just like writing who don't really have any kind of, I guess not a medical degree, but like a PsyD or like an LMFT or something.
And that's what I mean. Sorry, when I use the term horseshit, I mean, do you think that obviously I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm saying, do you think it's just talked about in a completely wrong way by the wrong people at times?
So I do think that taking the shock factor of it is kind of a mistake, but it is important to just talk about these issues because the way that these psychological diseases become established and get funding is that people do care about them. I mean, the thing about psychology is that like it is a soft science. It's not the same thing as like studying cancer or studying like diabetes or whatever that have very consistent, easily controlled ways of understanding how they work in the body. So when we're asking whether addiction is or is not a disease, and these articles will say it is or it isn't, or brain scans, blah blah blah. It's not really about. This is something that's really bad with just like the media in general, that they'll like jump on these specific one study and just say like this is the answer to the entire question, and that's just like that's not how science works. It's about an aggregate and taking like a whole body of research that gives you controlled experiments, and like they take different factors into account that actually give you like a more objective truth. So there are two basic bodies that, if you were to consider authorities on the subject of addiction, and where we are right now is kind of an interesting point. And I guess you would call it like the history of gaming addiction, and that like you'll get two different answers from actual authoritative bodies about whether it's like an addiction or not. So the first one, that we reference, that I actually reference this a lot in my articles, is called the DSM, which are you familiar with it at all?
I'm very familiar with it. So it's only because I've got to deal with it at work, because if people aren't aware, like obviously through my work at the how do I say, the criminal justice system here in New South Wales, obviously you've got a similar thing in the US, I've no doubt, where people are also filtered through treatment centers. And if someone establishes that they have a mental condition or a mental illness and they've committed a crime, at times where appropriate, rather than either sending them to jail or giving them a criminal punishment, we will filter them through treatment centers in order to address the problem, rather than just punishing them for their crime, if you know what I mean. So I deal with what sometimes people try and claim mental conditions that aren't mental conditions, and I've got to sometimes look to the DSM and break down like what's legit. Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. I mean, like it kind of filters that way. I didn't even consider that in your line of work, but that totally makes sense. So this is kind of especially relevant then, because the DSM currently in the version 5, which was released in 2013, it says that gaming disorder is a condition for further study. So it does not acknowledge it as an actual addiction per se. But then if you ask the WHO, which is like another organization, which is like a little more liberal in how it defines diseases, they have the ICD-11. Do you use that in your?
No, I haven't heard of that one.
Okay. That kind of says it, right? Because so they say that it is an addiction. That was actually announced in like June of this year.
Yep.
So it was super recent that they, and it was like all over. I think I actually ended up sharing that in our social media stuff at work, that video game addiction was announced by the WHO as a real disorder. So, but you can take that for what it's worth.
The WHO, that's World Health Organization, is that right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm glad you brought that up. Literally, that was my next note, sitting here staring me in the face, is that it was tagged as a condition for further study, in that DSM-5. Now, when you hear that personally, and again with the experiences that you've had, is that somewhat disheartening to you that it hasn't gotten into the DSM yet?
Not at all. So my entire life has kind of been saturated by like mental illness. I mean, this is another thing that like, I guess I can kind of go into super personal details because it's kind of relevant to this whole gaming disorder thing. So I was diagnosed with major depression. Officially it was right after that relationship with this guy in the World of Warcraft thing, whatever. But, I've kind of suffered with these symptoms since, my dad committed suicide when I was 9. He was manic depressive, which at the time was, or they called it at the time manic depressive, but now it's known as bipolar.
That's right.
So yeah. And so it has a highly genetic component. And so like, I probably would have gotten there anyway, but I definitely think that like WoW was one of the symptoms that helped me to, I guess, recognize that I had these really unhealthy ways of dealing with like my emotions and like kind of channeling, whatever the way that I was feeling at the time. And it helped me, well, I mean, that was also kind of in conjunction with the really unhealthy relationship I was in, but it eventually landed me in therapy, which like helped me to get antidepressants, which really like put my life on a positive trajectory. You know, as much as they want to say that like gaming disorder is or is not an addiction or whatever, like I don't think that really makes that much of a difference in terms of people who are affected by it, because like that's not really, you know, I don't have a degree in psychology or whatever. I just write on it all the time. But my personal opinion on the subject is that it comes from another place, you know, like it's a symptom. Like I said earlier, it's a symptom rather than a cause. So if you're going to like get help for something, and if you have these issues with playing too much WoW or whatever it is, it's probably something else that's actually causing it.
Yeah.
And the DSM shouldn't recognize it as a problem if it's not what's actually the issue.
I must thank you, obviously, for divulging such personal details. And obviously, I'm so sorry that it's, you know, it sounds like these things that have happened to you, it's obviously incredibly personal. And if you obviously you're okay with sharing it, thank you so much for being able to tell these stories and give us a bit more of an insight into you and what you've gone through. If I can explore something related to that and your personal situation, obviously taking into account the horrible things that have happened to you in the past. Have you, through your time in World of Warcraft or gaming in general, have you come across many people, because it's something that I do notice quite a bit, and I ask you, there does seem to be somewhat of a relatively prevalent link between people suffering through depression and gamers. It comes up a lot. You know, if you scroll through Twitter, if you look online on forums, there are a lot of people openly addressing the struggles that they're going through with depression and the fact that they are, you know, hardcore gamers. You know, and that equally applies to World of Warcraft. A lot of WoW players really do unfortunately seem to struggle with depression. Do you think that there's something about gaming that has people that unfortunately have this condition gravitate towards it? What's the link there? Do you think, have you come across many people who are gamers with depression?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's anyone who's played games would kind of notice that link, just because it is so common. I mean, there are a lot of explanations for it, but I think at least to me, one of the most obvious reasons is just because I'm just going to talk about in terms of depression, like I mean, I guess that's what the topic is, because there are a lot of like mental disorders out there that might make people gravitate toward games or whatever. In terms of depression, I guess it kind of helps to understand what depression actually is. So there's a big misconception out there about what it means to be depressed. So it's not really driven by, a lot of people think that when you're depressed, you have all these symptoms where, you know, you're sad or whatever, but there's a big difference between, you know, being sad after like a parent died or whatever and having actual clinical depression that's diagnosed under certain criteria. So, when you have clinical depression, it kind of gets you in this, MO where you are kind of like stuck at home and you isolate a lot. Some of the ways that people respond to, it's kind of hard to describe. So, my personal experience of depression is that I call it my black cloud. And so it's something that just like kind of like I actually have a pretty high functioning version of it, which like not everyone is blessed with. But it's just kind of this thing where like I'll be going about my normal day and it like is this fog that just like descends on me, and I just kind of like go from being just like having normal thoughts or whatever to like kind of staring through this like veil around me that just makes it really hard to even like get out of bed to go you know, do basic stuff like going to the store or like going to work or whatever. I can typically do all those things, but in terms of like when all of that is done, like it's really hard to kind of rile myself up to like go out and see friends or like go out and do, you know, XYZ with your social life. And so, you know, everyone has different symptoms of depression, but that's a pretty shared symptom, is that you isolate just because it's really hard to function with it. the way that your mind is working. It's just, you don't have as much agency over your physical body. So, when you are in the World of Warcraft or whatever game it may be, you don't actually need to like get out of bed to play it, especially if you have like a laptop or whatever. But like, there's just, I guess a better way of putting it is that like there's a lower barrier of entry for the amount of stimulation that it offers. So it's easier to actually get hooked into the world while you're experiencing depressive symptoms, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And I guess, as you say, the words getting hooked into the world, it makes me think of, something that we talk about so often, which is escapism. And the way in which people use video games as that vehicle to escapism. And are we trying to run away for a brief moment? I mean, it's no different really when people talk about, I go to the cinema to see a movie so I can just get away from it all for 2 hours and just not worry about what's happening in real life. And you can just go and, switch off, if you will. And obviously when we play video games, we might be playing for longer sessions, and really do you find that you've used it in the past, or do you think that in general people do perhaps deal with depression in ways by using video games as an escape tool and being able to forget about it? Or do you find that it might exacerbate things?
That's an interesting question. So like, I think that it just is, the answer is depends. So it can certainly exacerbate it if you get to the point where like you're depressed and you play WoW and you just keep playing WoW and it just doesn't go anywhere from there. But for me personally, so like I did have that period in my life where I was just playing it too much because of the social circumstances around me with my relationship and stuff. But after I got out of that and was able to kind of like, I actually stayed with the game, like obviously, but once I started going to therapy and once I started like actually addressing some of the depressive symptoms, I found that WoW kind of offered an avenue to process some of the things that I was talking about in therapy. So I wouldn't say that isolation is the best answer to addressing your depressive symptoms, but it does give you an opportunity to, I guess I should kind of explain what I mean by thinking about therapy.
Yeah, sure.
So there's two main types of therapy. So the first one is CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is basically where your therapist will like tell you to kind of step back and examine the way that you react to things and your behaviors and get you to really kind of dig deeper as to why you have these ingrained responses of like, I'm worthless, or like my life doesn't matter, or all of these things. These are all very unreasonable responses to the stimulus that happened to you. And in order to make those really negative thought processes, they're just on this constant feedback loop, right? And so like you want to stop them. And in order to do that, you kind of need to like sit down and think about how the things that cause you that like trigger those emotions, and that like how you can redirect them and how you can kind of change the way that you think. So it's kind of like stepping back and looking at your own mind. And like in order to do that, you kind of need to be like, they call it doing your homework in therapy. And I found that like doing my homework was it's kind of meditative, I guess, to like, my version of it was kind of doing like the professions in WoW. I like to do like archaeology and mining and fishing and all those types of things. So, I would just kind of think about like my therapy sessions while I was doing it. And like, I think that was actually quite helpful for me. And at that point in my life, I had kind of, I had cut down my WoW usage to a much healthier level. So I was only playing like, an hour, 2 hours a day or whatever. So yeah, I definitely think that like WoW can be a thing where like you do use it as an escape and you use it as a replacement for seeing your friends or whatever, but it does have its place, I think.
Yeah. Well, in using it as an escape, and you just touched on in that answer there, the unfortunate feeling that people might fall into if they are experiencing drastic depression or anything like that is the sense of feeling worthless. And you talked about a really interesting concept, even though I'm sure everyone is quite aware of what I'm about to talk about, but I didn't know of the term. And as I said, I was reading a number of your articles, which I really, really enjoyed, and I'll have to link them in the Discord once this chat is done. But you talked about the concept of imposter syndrome, and I wanted to just quickly flesh that out a little bit more, because if I can, as I do here on the show, quote you back to you for a second and just read a couple of paragraphs here. You said that many of us are our own worst critics. For some people, that's a positive thing. Internal constructive criticism drives us to improve ourselves and do better, right? unfortunately, that's not always the case. This constant stream of inner criticism causes us to question whether we are really qualified at work, school, among our peers, and even at home. Imposter syndrome describes the deep internalized fear that you're actually a fraud, that any accomplishments you've achieved were misplaced, and one day people will discover that you're not actually qualified. It's a misplaced, fear-driven psychological phenomenon that can drive self-sabotaging behaviors like self-medication with alcohol. Now, one thing I wanted to sort of explore with this is when we talk again about escapism and diving into WoW, WoW obviously gives people the opportunity to excel at certain fields within the game. You talked about professions. We all know that you can jump onto a server and maybe try and be the well-known enchanter, the person that stands in the middle of Stormwind, that has great deals and has all the enchants and people love them. You have the best PvP player on the server, like, oh man, that rogue is a god at the game, things like that. And you can build up a character that is revered. And do you find that some people may, and what might be the explanation behind people chasing excellence in WoW, is that a form of escapism maybe, or would people look to do that in order to avoid dealing with the imposter syndrome when they might feel that they've convinced themselves, unfortunately, that things are not working out personally, they're not so great in life. For some reason, even though that's not the case, they've convinced themselves of that, and they turn to WoW to be that great person they think that they're not in real life. Do you know where I'm going with this? Do you think that's something that people may look to do and address issues that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something that unfortunately happens to a lot of people who play WoW. I mean, I don't know what the percentage would be or anything, but, I mean, I wouldn't rush to say that, like, anyone who takes WoW seriously fits into that category, because I do think that, there's like a healthy way that you can, play World of Warcraft and like be good at it and all that stuff. But yeah, no, I totally know what you mean in terms of people who, use it as a way to kind of prove themselves to themselves that they can be good at things or whatever. It's kind of sad that that's the way that things get channeled, but I do still strongly believe that it's it's a symptom of other things. It's not really because of WoW that happens. And that's something that you should really talk to your therapist about, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's really unfortunate that so I guess it's kind of late in the discussion to kind of thank you for for bringing up the whole topic of mental health and depression and stuff on your show, because it's like a topic that's not very sexy. I was listening to kind of some of the other more recent podcasts that you've done with heavy metal music and warriors are so cool and all of these things that are really fun about WoW. But a lot of people who play do have these kind of darker, more secret, I guess personal maybe is a better word, ways that they play the game that are things that could be addressed if they were to kind of acknowledge that they're having other issues. But mental health is just so fucking stigmatized that people don't get help for it, and it's out there. So I just think it's really cool that you wanted to talk about it on your show and kind of normalize it.
No, I appreciate that. And it's something that, like I said, when I touched on it, many, many episodes ago now, it receives such a positive reception that, I've never been shy in talking about things like this. And I think it's important to, whilst it's all well and good and it's easy to sit here and say, as you say, WoW is cool and let's talk about all the cool things. I like WoW because WoW is great, keep the conversation generalized. Yeah. It's so important to step outside of the box and sort of find out what we as players deal with behind the scenes as well. There's so much more to talk about that I feel is really, equally important and critical. And so, whilst you say, it's not a sexy conversation, if people come into a podcast episode like this, kind of knowing what they're going to get and being prepared for, okay, this is a bit of more of a serious tone about an external topic that's related to WoW, people are still interested in hearing about it. And I think that it's something that I won't be afraid to explore later down the track as well. Now, it's not, I have said in the past, even though we address the issues, it's not like the podcast is becoming the mental health podcast. It's still the WoW podcast. But
sure,
absolutely, it's important to talk about things like this, because then you also talk about things like, you mentioned treatment a few times. And if someone were to realize that they might have an issue, how you then go about dealing with it. And that's something that really stuck with me when I play this call. I'm hoping to have it as basically a mental health / addiction episode, because I've got some other calls in the bank that I've had for about 6 months, and I've apologized to those listeners saying, look, I'm waiting for the right time to release these calls. And luckily they've been cool with that, but they went into their own WoW addictions. And I think the thing that stuck with me from those calls is they started to talk about moments of realization where you sit down and realize, oh shit, I've got a problem. And they talked about, some of the lying that started to creep into their lives when they wouldn't tell their girlfriends or family or loved ones what they were really doing, skipping work to play WoW. And then the moment of addressing it was really a interesting thing to hear about, where they come clean. And I think, something that you've said as well through your articles is that if you do decide to address it, how do you go about doing it? And you've said that, again, to quote you, back to you, oftentimes disclosing struggles brings people closer together. You may be surprised to learn that your family member has also had struggles with substance abuse. For those less familiar with the disease, the stigma against it mostly exists in a vacuum. Once they put a face to it, particularly the face of a family member that they care about, it suddenly becomes real. So if I could just ask you to talk about how people should be addressing a problem once they identify that they might have a problem, and, how hard it might be to front up to family and confess.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's really fun. Like, I probably should have listened to those podcasts that you're talking about. I haven't listened to your entire thing, but that
No, that's all right.
No, I only laughed because earlier in our conversation, I was kind of talking about how much I was playing WoW, and I was kind of trying to skirt around the fact that we were taking amphetamines while we were playing. And so I kind of get the whole point of underplaying and lying about the way that you, consume the game or whatever to kind of underplay it. So anyway, so I think that in terms of once you start to kind of have these realizations that, maybe you do need help, I mean, it's good. I would say that it's good to start small and just kind of talk to your friends about it, just because that kind of makes it real for you. But the only real way to get help that I think is really useful is to see a professional. So it's hard to do, which is that's kind of why I said maybe you should talk to your friends about it first, even your guild mates or whatever, just to kind of start to break the barrier. And if you have that relationship with your family, you can talk to them about it too, because I guess not everyone really needs professional help, but it's a very individualized problem too. So that's kind of the issue with it. But in terms of WoW addiction, I mean, it's kind of hard to say.
It's all obviously very subjective, but you also mentioned something that, again, sort of piqued my interest, where when we talk about the addressing stage, if you do happen to realize that you have a problem, well, that doesn't necessarily come as a moment of clarity for everyone. There are obviously addicts out there that just don't realize it or think they're fine. And again, we normally associate this with narcotics addiction. You hear about an addict saying, I don't have a problem, I can quit any time.
Right.
And I really don't think that would be any different. And I don't think it's crass or anything to draw the distinction between that and World of Warcraft as well, where I've no doubt there are players putting in, a ridiculous amount of time into the game, but sitting around going, oh, I'm fine, I'm not an addict, I could walk away tomorrow, please, I'd uninstall it a second if I got over it, I'm fine.
Right.
Do you think that level of denial, again, do you agree with me that is something that probably happens in WoW, and how could people, go about addressing that? And have you bumped into that at all in your experience?
Oh my goodness. So I mean, the denial phase of addiction is the only reason I have a job right now.
Right.
Is just because, people have, we call it the stages of change. And so one of the first stage is where you're just in your active addiction, where you're using and you don't see that there's a problem, which is kind of what you just described. And then it goes into pre-contemplation, which is where you're kind of maybe, I shouldn't be playing for X amount of time, or you just have these errant kind of thoughts where you kind of start to realize that there's a problem. And then it goes into contemplation, action, blah, blah, blah. So there's the whole, I guess, psychological step to it that we talk about in treatment. But, in terms of actually getting that process going, the stages of change, it's hard to say. Like, that's one of the reasons that, like, you know, you were talking earlier about these sensationalist articles that like really rile people up about, is it an addiction, blah, blah, blah. You know, it's hard to say that that's useful information, like scientifically, because it's just not. But in terms of actually helping people, like say like a family member were to see something like that and then they recognize, oh, you know, my son or like my nephew or whatever it is displaying some of these symptoms. And so I'm going to bring it up to him and just kind of talk about this article that I read and like that it might be a problem. And so like, regardless of the fact that these articles have like basically zero value to the psychological community about gaming addiction, in terms of actually changing people's lives, I think that they can serve a really great purpose to kind of like bring attention to it to, you know, either family members or, you know, the people themselves to kind of like be more self-reflective about their behaviors. So.
Absolutely. Well, I guess one of the final points would be, you know, when people do actually realize that they have a problem, and we've touched on this a little bit earlier, but if there is that final moment where they go, okay, enough's enough, it is time to do something about this, what can you tell people specifically about avenues in which to treat an addiction or perhaps depression problem as well?
That's a tough question. So like it really depends on what, at least in America, it depends on what your resources are, because we have a private health insurance system here where like we don't actually like, we don't cover video game addiction, but you like if you do have private insurance through your employer, like you can get at least access to therapy. So like it just, you wouldn't necessarily go to like an actual video game addiction treatment center unless you could do private pay, but you could at least go through like your mental health network, hopefully, if you have coverage to see someone. So there's that therapist. They also, so that's like a private individual that you'd be able to see that like is either an LMFT or a psychologist or even a psychiatrist that could prescribe you medication if you have a mood disorder or whatever. But they also have support groups that, for people with mood disorders, which, they can be helpful, but I would also just be very wary of, sometimes if, it just depends on the community, but like talking to people who have mood disorders about your mood disorder is not always the most effective way to get help. So, it just kind of depends on what your resources are. And like that's one thing that really sucks about having like depression or like addiction or whatever is that actually making a change in your life requires agency. It first takes the step of recognizing that you have a problem, and then you have to jump through like 5 or 6 different hoops to actually get help. This is something that has really frustrated me in my own life, that like it's been hard for me to like find a consistent psychiatrist and like whatever. So I guess my advice would be to just stick to it
Right.
and like be serious about it. So yeah.
Jamie, I can't thank you enough for going into all of this, and you've been so fantastic on this call. I really
thank you.
No, I'm blown away by obviously your level of professionalism and also, you know, some of the personal details that you've been able to divulge to us through the call. It's one of those things where, you know, I really do champion, even though I don't talk about it on the show a lot, you know, I will have to try and get it more out there in the future. I champion, you know, not being, this is going to sound like a relatively crass tangent to take, but not being a dick to people in game, because, you know, we're all people, there are people behind these characters. And even though everyone knows that, it's great to say, yeah, okay, there's a person, you know, sitting at a keyboard behind these characters. Great. But also that person has personal stuff going on, and you just don't know what they've been through or what they're going through. So when you take those moments to really go out of your way to be a fuckwit to someone, you just maybe don't know what you're doing. So I'm not trying to champion the whole sort of why can't we all just get along thing. I'm not saying don't go out and gank someone. You know what I mean? I'm not trying to create a world of peacecraft here.
Oh yeah, but like don't tell someone that they're trash because like they're already having the soundtrack in their head where they're telling themselves that already. Yeah,
Exactly.
That was kind of something that I kind of wanted to point out too, is that like WoW has a really fucking toxic community sometimes. Like sometimes it's really great. Like one of the reasons I really support your whole thing that you're doing here is that like the community is so mature and so like positive, and like they build each other up, whereas a lot of the people who play WoW, I mean like percentage wise who knows what it is, but like there are a lot of trolls in this game, and like they don't understand the thing, like you just said, what you say to people, they don't understand that it actually matters. So
Absolutely. And it's one of the things, and believe me, Jamie, you're part of this community. It blows me away on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. You know, some of the voices that are in this community and how mature so many of them are. And as you say, we kind of get this, there is the stigma out there if you don't go looking very hard that yes, it's, you know, video games or World of Warcraft is completely populated by immature trolls who just want to fuck around, gank people and tell them all to kill themselves. Oh, that's video gamers now. It's like, no, that's
so
not,
funny.
that's not everyone. There's a vast, vast number of us who are, you know, we're fine.
Mm-hmm. And they can actually form like meaningful like friendships with people who have depression, who can't get out of bed. Like, yeah, no, I totally get that. Like, it's, you know, a really positive force. It's cool. Oh.
Jamie, once again, let me just sort of wrap it up by profusely thanking you for taking part in this call. I know it's not the, you know, easiest of topics to discuss, particularly when you start weaving in some of your personal experiences. And I can't thank you enough for opening your life up to the, you know, thousands of listeners of Countdown to Classic, and also providing such an amazing insight and level of professionalism in this call. It's very, very clear to me that you are incredibly in tune with your industry and the very serious issues that you deal with on a daily basis. And I just can't thank you enough.
Yeah, I'm happy to be on the show. And I really hope that, like, you know, people either find it interesting, but also, like, if you need help, like, go get it. Like, you're worth it, you know?
Thanks so much, Jamie. We'll speak to you later.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Josh.
Okay, we've got another couple of callers on the line now, and I believe we're speaking with Tim. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct.
And Tim, where in the world are you calling from?
I am in Los Angeles, California.
And we've also got Para. And Para, where are you calling from?
From the Bay Area, California.
Excellent. Fantastic. Now, the reason I've got the both of you combined on this particular call is that you both hit me up separately, and we're going to talk about the same topic basically, but you both had some pretty specific sort of niche ways in which to talk about this topic that grabbed my attention. And that topic is that the serious one of video game addiction and more specifically WoW addiction. So what I'd like to do is basically get both of your stories about your experiences back in the day, and we'll explore a little bit, you know, the two of you might find similarities between your personal experiences and whatnot. So we'll start with you, Tim. If you can just tell people exactly what your story was with perhaps playing a little or a lot too much WoW back in the day.
Yeah, sure. So basically I started playing 2004, and I was in high school at the time, like 16 or so. And I, you know, at first it was pretty casual, just playing with friends and meeting new people, and it was a lot of fun. But it sort of started to get to the point where I'd be playing 7-8 hours a day. It wasn't great. Eventually, because I have great loving parents, they were able to be like, you need to stop. And my friends kind of had a similar thing of like, hey, like hang out with us more, like in real life. So it wasn't too bad. But it was when I got to college in 2006 and then 2007, combined with some other things that happened in my personal life, which triggered. I suffered from depression, and so that was the first time it got triggered for me, and that sort of made me all kind of spiral into WoW to the point where I'd be playing. I was probably averaging easily 14, 15 hours a day. You know, not taking care of myself, mostly just ordering food in, despite the fact that I didn't have the money for it. So you know, going into a lot of debt as well. For that. And, you know, it was just generally a bad time. You know, my girlfriend broke up with me, and I just kept spiraling in until it got to the point in 2008, when like Wrath of the Lich King hype was really big. I ended up having to make a decision that like something's wrong with me. And I had to not only uninstall the game from all my computers, but, break my physical disk. And so, yeah, so that was sort of when I was like, something was really wrong. And it wasn't until later that I learned that I was addicted and that it was something more than just I play the game a lot. But yeah, that's basically what happened for me.
Okay, now I'll have a few follow-up questions later on for you, but moving on now to you, Para, if we can just get a general outlay of your particular story with World of Warcraft addiction.
Yeah, so similarly, I started playing World of Warcraft in like late 2005. I really didn't actually hit my peak till TBC, but I started playing and I was into the game. I loved it. All my friends were, and I would just come home from school and I would play it all day with my friends. And I would play till the evening and I would go to bed. And it never really a big deal at first. My dad even tried to start playing because he wanted to do some sort of bonding. But it became a problem with my school. In 10th grade of high school, I was really playing a lot of World of Warcraft. So much so that because I came home and my parents both worked into the evening, I would just come home and I would play World of Warcraft. My parents would get home. Hey, did you do your homework? Of course I did. And I hadn't. I just been playing WoW all day. And then I would play all into the evening. And I would stay up late and I'd be like, oh, I'm going to bed. And then I would stay up and play all night. And then I wouldn't get sleep. I'd be late to school. And I just kept building excuses and finding reasons. And I almost actually failed like 3 classes in the 10th grade. And basically it came to the point where my teacher sat down with my parents and said, he's not doing any of his homework. He's not taking any tests. He's like missing class. Are you guys okay with this? And they're like, what? That is not any idea of what we have was going on. And so then I was kind of caught and I had to kind of sit down and be like, well, I play a lot of video games. And so then it was a real hard stop for me, actually. I basically just had to just let go of WoW for a while. I did come back eventually, but at that point, all my friends stopped playing, and it kind of fizzled for me. And until I found private servers, I didn't really deal with the WoW addiction really again.
Okay, so there's a few follow-up questions I've got for both of you, and thank you so much just for that general outlook on what was going on with both of you at the time. But I'll come back to you, Tim, and I'll just ask you about what was that feeling? You described the moment when you actually had to physically break the disk so that you could not reinstall the game if you attempted back. What was it like in that moment when you were standing there having to, destroy this stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was really rough. And to go with what Paris said, it deeply affected my school. I also failed 3 classes in college. And had to, I was on academic probation, so I got a letter from the school, which I actually still have. It's actually, I keep it on my wall as a reminder of how bad things can get, but that I can always recover from it. And that moment of breaking the disc was because I had quit WoW before, so I knew that this was a thing that I could do. But every time I would quit, I'd just come back because I just had the disc, so I just, throw them back in, reinstall. So I knew that if I was going to take the step that I needed to take to fully break, to fully try to get myself better, I had to do this. And I remember actually, I don't cry a lot, but I actually cried that day, not because I was sad that I was breaking these discs, but just out of this realization that this is a lot worse than I thought it was.
Para, I'd come back to you for this one and ask you a similar question in that you described the moment when you were essentially confronted by your parents. And I don't know if yours wasn't as much a decision to stop as you were forced to stop. But how did it feel at that moment when you essentially went cold turkey?
I mean, it was incredibly emotional because it was a lot of things at once, right? It was coming to terms with the fact that I had a problem. It was my parents being so mad that I had lied to them. They were so disappointed in me that I actually was failing in school. I mean, it was just this huge, just from every angle, sort of emotional, attack. I mean, not attack at me, but I just kind of melted down. I remember in that classroom, I was actually with the teacher with a little conference, and I remember just sort of melting down right there. And then my parents just being like, we'll leave, we'll handle this. And thankfully my parents, I worked it out. I ended up passing the 10th grade, but it was just this crazy, the next 3 months, my parents didn't trust me around a computer. I mean, I wasn't allowed to it was really you have a problem. And I felt like I was treated almost we can't trust you until you prove again that, you're not just going to lie to us and start playing video games, almost like an actual addict, which, I mean, it was an addiction. And so, yeah, it was incredibly emotional to have to confront all of that at once.
Well, it sounds like you were very lucky to have some understanding parents there as a support base for you. And Tim, I'd come back to you and ask, when you were trying to deal with your quitting of the game, were you open and honest with anyone about it? Did you have any kind of support base behind you, or were you doing it alone?
I mean, I've always had a good support base in my family, which has always been good. And they helped me in high school with it. But the problem I had is that, when you get to college, and I think this is normal for almost everybody, you're given a degree of independence that you don't have. You're living on your own. You don't have to answer to your family anymore. And to some degree, there's a net that's taken away. So I was not honest with them. But they knew, like, it was that thing of, I remember that summer, especially after I had failed all the classes, I'd gotten the academic probation letter. I'd broken up with my girlfriend a few months ago, prior. I'd gained a lot of weight. And my parents knew something was wrong, and they kept asking me, "So Tim, how are your grades going?" And I just kept avoiding it and sort of lying to them and saying, "It's fine. I just can't show them to you." And so they were always encouraging me to try to like tell them, but my family's not always great about being open and honest about that kind of stuff, but they still were always supporting. And when a few months later, after I'd broken the disc and sort of figured it out, I told them, I was honest with them. I was like, this is what was happening during the summer. This is what I was feeling. And they were really great. They helped. They were the first ones that sort of said, you should go see a doctor and a therapist about this. This sounds like it's something more than just, because even at that point, I knew it was bad, but I wasn't using the term addiction. I was very much in the mindset of, well, that's not me. I can't be addicted to something. I don't have a mental illness, because it was very, it was like, I thought it would make me a pariah, which it didn't. And I know that now, but so they were the first to encourage me to do that. So that was really good to have.
You mentioned that sort of one instance of, a little bit of deception going on with perhaps saying to the parents, no, it's all good, I can't show you the grades. And both of you have now talked on perhaps some white lies, or a little bit more than white lies, that were going on to kind of, divert people away from the real problem that might have been going on with you. So coming back to you, Para, my question would be this. I think you mentioned to me, and you may have mentioned earlier, that you started to also perhaps, skip work. You weren't being honest with your girlfriend about what was going on. So I'd ask you to tell us a little bit more about the lies that you'd started to tell, and how did you feel when you needed to start being dishonest with people in order to keep the addiction going?
Yeah, that's actually like a little more recent. So I rediscovered private servers, and I started playing again, and I thought to myself, I joked with myself and my friends like, oh, here we go, guys, like down the rabbit hole again. We all remember that, right? And I thought like, oh, I'm an adult now. I have like a salaried job. I go to work. I have a cat. Like there's no way that I could fall into this again. And I just, it's no different, because it is just as fun, and that same thrill, that same everything of running a dungeon, I got a new piece, I leveled up, like that same progression that you get as you play. And it's so real, and it's never changed. And so because I have the same brain and I played the same game, I don't know why I expected a different outcome. So I started playing a lot of WoW again. And my girlfriend's not super into WoW. She's just kind of like, oh, that's like that thing you do that you sit there and yell, whatever. Go play Overwatch. I like that one better. And but she was just kind of like, whatever. And then I noticed myself like, oh, I'll call in sick to work today to play WoW. And it wasn't a big deal. Nothing at work was falling under, but it's just, I would skip work, and my girlfriend would be like, oh, what'd you do today at work? And I didn't want to say like, oh, I skipped work to play WoW, like, oh, I went in today and did this, but oh, I left early. That's why I was home before you, because I never get home first, So it just started building this little stepping stones of distrust about it, because I wasn't clear with it with her. And then one day, I took another day off work, and I was sitting there at like 11 a.m. playing WoW, and I just remember like my girlfriend was like, oh, how's work today? And I was like, fuck, I did this again. And I realized that's when I had that moment of self-realization, which I never had as a kid. And I was like, this is an issue. I've skipped work like twice in the last month. I'm lying to my girlfriend about it. My friends have no idea how much I'm playing. This is an issue. And I kind of had to sit down and say, like, I'm not going to let myself do this again. And so I had to basically bring my girlfriend into it as a support system and say like, hey, I know that I've joked about this being a problem. I feel like it's kind of hitting me again. And I just want us to be honest about this because it's not a problem right now. I mean, those little things are, but I'm going to change that. But I want you to keep me like 110% honest about this because if that happens again, like I could not imagine losing a job over World of Warcraft. I'm sure people have, but I mean, I seriously don't know what I would do with myself if I was faced with like that kind of situation. So it can happen again, and that's kind of where I'm at now. And thankfully, I'm in a much more supportive and healthy relationship with World of Warcraft, but we'll see once Classic launches.
Okay. Now, Tim, I'd ask you a relatively similar question, just in terms of what was perhaps one of the bigger lies that you told during your time with the game?
Probably one of the bigger lies was actually a truth, which is going to sound weird. But so I broke up with my girlfriend. I was the one who initiated it. And she was great. She did not like me playing games at all. I mean, she saw kind of what it was doing to me. It was trying to get me to stop. But she had gone away to do a semester abroad, and she wanted to be on the phone all the time and like in Skype and do all that. And I remember this must have been 2007, and I was just annoyed because all I wanted to do was play WoW. And every time I spoke with her, anytime I interacted with her, I was literally thinking, man, I could be getting better loot. I could be getting a cool mount. I could be whatever it was. So I broke up with her, but I was such a coward in breaking up with her that I couldn't be honest. And so what I told her was, oh, I have an addiction to WoW, and I need to fix that for myself. And I cried and all this stuff on the phone. I put on this whole show, and she was like, I'm so sorry, and you have to go fix yourself. And then I hung up the phone, and I was like, aha, I tricked her. But in reality, that's what it was, and I just didn't even realize it. So it was this weird, I thought I was lying to her, but really I was telling the truth in this strange way.
Interesting. Now, you mentioned something that has actually come up on the podcast earlier when I had two of my buddies on the show, Chans and Loy, and Chan started telling us very lightly about his addiction with the game. And he went on to say that he was thinking about WoW during day-to-day life, when he had to be at work, when he was driving around, not being able to be at his computer. And he went to the sort of nth degree, and I don't know, sort of, he swears it's true, but he was saying that he started seeing maps in front of him when he was driving around as if he was looking at the map of Azeroth, and he was thinking of God, where do I go to get quests? And he was being a bit hyperbolic, but saying basically that he started to think about the game so much outside of playing that it became an issue. So my next question back to you, Para, would be, you mentioned that obviously you had all those troubles in the 10th grade. Were you just non-stop thinking about WoW during the day when you weren't at your computer? And what kind of thoughts were you having?
Yeah, all that was going through my brain was WoW, and my friends all played WoW at school, so between breaks, at lunch, all we would do was talk about it. So I never really wasn't thinking about WoW, and all the time. It would be, oh, what dungeons are we going to run? Oh, our friend is out. Can one of us, can we get someone to tank this? Does someone have a healer? We would just be thinking about what we were going to do when we got home. It was like we're sentenced to school for the day to stop us from playing for 8 hours, so then we could get home and do it. And it definitely didn't help. I mean, it helped that all my friends were playing, but it didn't help because all we did as a group was socialize via WoW. And that, they were not helpful in this whole process in a number of ways, but definitely not in keeping me WoW off my mind.
Tim, turning back to you, you mentioned obviously you were at university trying to get a degree while you were going through your problems. And to what degree would you think about WoW when you weren't sitting at your computer? I know that obviously when I was doing my law degree, I had a similar issue to you that I haven't really touched on, but it wasn't to a problem area per se for me, but I've said to people that, listeners know I played WoW during my time at law school. I played about 15 hours a week, which is obviously not a lot in the grand scheme of things compared to many other players, and obviously compared to what the two of you were going through at the time. But still, I was thinking about WoW during law lectures, not all the time, but my mind would wander off when you're a particularly boring lecture and I start, I'm sitting here hearing about about torts and contracts and criminal law and all that jazz and equity. And I'm like, I don't give a fuck about this stuff. And I'd start thinking about, I wonder what I'll farm when I go back home after this lecture. And my mind would wander. And I wound up, I had a half scholarship to university, and I went to a university where that half scholarship was really helpful. My parents were very grateful for the fact that they were only paying half price. But late in my degree, I did lose my half scholarship because I didn't keep up my grades, but that was mainly due to sort of the laissez-faire attitude I have. I was partying a lot, I was drinking a lot, I was like, youth is for the young, I was going nuts. But WoW was sort of a part of it in terms of, I would put off a little bit of study here and there to play WoW. So coming back to the question, is during your time at university, were you being distracted when you were going to classes or things like that by WoW?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it wasn't as bad at first, right? Because when you first start university, it's an awesome experience, frankly. You're independent, you're meeting all these new people you're in this like really strange, wonderful community experience where everybody wants to meet new people. And everybody's eager to be open and have a lot of fun. So it wasn't bad for maybe the first few months, but eventually it got to the point where I would be, as you're saying, I'd be in class. That's all I'd be thinking about. I'd be thinking about, I was in a raiding guild, so I'd be doing raids 3-4 times a week. So I would only be thinking about that. What consumables do I need? Do I need a better spec this week? What's all that stuff. At one point, I remember sometime in sophomore year, it got to the point where I figured out that I could bring my computer to class and look like I was typing and look like I was taking notes, but I could put one of those like earbuds in and it wouldn't be that visible to the professor, especially in the big lecture hall. And I could have vent on. So I could just be in vent with all my guildies and they'd be talking about stuff and I could just occasionally type into vent without needing to speak. And so I would just do that rather than pay attention to the class.
Now, we've heard the stories and obviously heard the trials and tribulations that the two of you went through. Let's sort of take it a bit more on the upswing now as we start to round out your experiences. If you could go back in time and talk to your younger self when you were starting to fall down this rabbit hole with World of Warcraft, Para, what would you say to yourself?
Oh man, that's a good question. I could think of a lot of things to tell myself, but if any of them would actually change what happened, I don't know.
Would any part of you at all want to veer yourself away from the game?
I turned out all right, so no. But I think I might have. Actually, I probably would have talked to my parents if I could go back in time and told them to. My parents weren't super involved with me, so I think that's part of why I was able to get away with it so much. Is because we were almost roommates as opposed to like a family. So I didn't see them a lot. We didn't talk a lot. And they just assumed and took my word that things were going well. So I think I would actually probably tell them, focus a little more or at least pry a little bit into your kid who doesn't leave his room for 7 hours a day after school. Because no teenage kid has everything going swell for them, right? It was almost too good. And I think that's honestly what allowed me to kind of just go through it like that. Nobody was stopping me.
Tim, how about you? Is there anything that you would say to your past self when you were getting into the game that you know now that you didn't know then, or any words of advice?
I mean, that's a really good question. I got to echo Para that. It's tough because, I'd love to say a number of stuff, but I don't know if any of it would be useful. So I have a sister who's 9 years older than me, and she went through the same thing that I did. She was addicted. At the time, it was a MUD. They're like text-based MMOs, basically. But she was addicted in college. She was going to Princeton, so she was crazy smart. She lost her scholarship, failed out, left for a year. It was really bad, and my parents were always against video games because of that. And my sister told me all of this when I was 14, 13. So it's not like I didn't know that this was a problem and that this wouldn't be an issue. It's just, I don't know. I think I would, echoing Para as well, I think I would probably maybe not talk to my parents because I don't know at that age if I would have probably pushed back more against my parents, but I would have talked to my friends. I had some friends that I played that in real life that I played WoW with, but most of my friends, especially in college, I didn't play WoW with. So I would have talked to them, and I have some really great friends from college who I met freshman year, and they're amazing people. And I know they would help me if they were aware. So if I could go back in time, I would probably talk to them and be like, hey, I'm going through issues right now. Can you please help me?
On that last point that you just raised, throwing it back to you, Para, to sort of go out on a little bit of a, somewhat positive vibe in terms of the fact that there is hope. As you say, you turned out okay. What would you say to people who might be listening now who, may be thinking, shit, am I addicted to this game? What avenues would you suggest they explore in order to get a little bit of help or to address the issue?
I would say that the number one thing, especially now, but just in general, it's got to be having something, a community, friends, whatever, outside of World of Warcraft. Because the number one thing I think that you can do, especially if you're playing 15, 16 hours a day and you're not a streamer, you just do it because you can, is that there is really a whole lot outside of the World of Warcraft. There's the world of now outside. And there is so much to do, so many things to experience, and I get a lot of joy out of World of Warcraft, and those feelings they're not fake feelings just because it's a video game. But I think that focusing all of your enjoyment, all of your fun, all of your validation from a game really can be detrimental, because when you don't have it, like you're saying, even now when I'm at work, sometimes I'll be sitting in a meeting and my boss is talking about, all right, these experiments we have next week and these timelines and blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking about, I wonder if I could get a world drop if I farm for 4 hours like I need to. And it's like, you can't lose sight of the fact that there's a real world outside, and those feelings and emotions that you get can be found elsewhere. And if you lose WoW and you have all those other things to do, you're not lost. And you don't feel like there's nothing else to do, and you don't keep playing more WoW, because that's the only place you get any feelings from.
And Tim, to take us out here, what suggestions would you have for listeners who might realize they have a little bit of a problem and want to address the issue?
Yeah, I think the number one thing is definitely communication. If you are worried that you might have a problem, if you're starting to see some signs, or you're hearing the stories that Para and I are sharing, and you're thinking, oh wow, I've done some of that. Talk to people in your life who you care about, who you trust, who you love. And sometimes I understand that it can be tough to have, some people don't have a lot of those kind of people in their lives. The other thing I would say is don't be afraid to seek professional help. Therapists they're there for a reason, and they're really good. I see a therapist regularly. And it's such a healthy thing to do. And I would say this, don't just go for people out there. Like if you think, oh, I don't have any issues, still see a therapist. It's really just a healthy thing to do, a good person you can talk to and trust. And there's lots of good resources, because sometimes therapists are expensive, and I get that, but there are good resources you can find online that help you find either cheap or government-funded therapists in the U.S. at least. I'm sure internationally, it's probably actually better internationally because of the way our healthcare system works here. But so I would say, first, reach out to people around you who you care about, and second, seek professional help. Don't be afraid to do so. It's a really good resource and a tool that's there for you.
Very succinct advice there. Thank you so much for that. Look, guys, thank you so much for calling in. I can't thank you enough. And thanks for opening up with some pretty personal stories there. So I just want to say thank you to both of you. And I really hope to hear from you back on the show, where we can talk, obviously, about something a little bit more uplifting, some of the content on the game. But thanks one more time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having us.
You can also, I won't speak for Tim, but I'd be happy to chat with anybody, just if they want to know more, or they want to just talk to someone about the same kind of stuff, and they don't feel like they either have somebody or they're not comfortable, and you want to talk to a stranger on the internet who has no idea who you are, I'm in the Discord. I'd be happy to chat with you and just sort of feel it out or just listen.
Yeah, same here. I'm always happy to chat. That's definitely, feel free to reach out to us then, anybody. And my Discord name for anybody is TNSG, but you can just call me Tim, so.
Great point, guys. And I'll be putting in a little bit of a blanket statement at the end of the episode for sure to if anyone has any issues that they'd like to discuss, that they can always reach out to either me or some of the interviewees on the show or anyone in the Discord in general. We're a very friendly bunch and we're more than happy to talk about these things. Well, thanks very much, guys. We'll talk to you later.
See you. Thanks. Have a good one.
Hi, everyone. Did you know that the vast majority of callers that you hear on Countdown to Classic are residents of the Countdown to Classic Discord? Please do come and check us out. Outside of that, if you want to hear more from me, then follow me on Twitter at Counts2Classic with the number 2. I've also started streaming regularly, and you can find me on Twitch at Countdown to Classic. So please do come hang out and have some fun over there. If you want to call into the show, give feedback, or submit a memory lane or anger management of your own, then email me at feedback@countdowntoclassic.com. Now, let's get back to the show. Okay, we've got another caller on the line, and who are we speaking with?
Hey, I'm Kaleva, and I'm from Finland.
Thanks so much for calling in, Kaleva. Now, you reached out to me recently via a few PMs after you heard a few things on the show a short while ago, and you wanted to talk a bit more about World of Warcraft addiction and your experiences with that. So, I guess I would start by asking, if you don't mind, were you addicted to World of Warcraft, and how so?
Oh, definitely. I used pretty much all the time outside of school to play, and I fought my brothers and sisters over the computer because we only had one. We had a lot of bad fights over it. I also skipped a lot of school. I faked illnesses, and because my mom was trained as a nurse when she was younger, she didn't really buy it, so I had to go really long ways to fake it.
When you say faking an illness, to what kind of extent are we talking?
So every kid knows the fact about warming up the fever meters or whatever they're called, you know?
Yep, a thermometer, yep.
Yeah, the thermometer. But I actually had to force myself to throw up quite often because I told my mom that I was feeling quite ill and I couldn't go to school. So I fetched a bucket and shoved my fingers up my throat so I could throw up and come up as sick.
And were you doing that just to be able to stay home and play WoW all day?
Yes.
What grade of school were you in when you started doing this?
So I started playing WoW when I was in the 6th grade. And I know the school system is quite different in Finland than other countries, but I think I was 13, 14, somewhere along the lines. When
you weren't skipping school, how many hours were you playing on school days?
So let's say that if I came home at 4 p.m., I'd if I could get a hold on the computer, if I didn't have to fight my brothers and sisters of it, I would just sit there as long as I could, and then usually I just stopped when my mother told me get the fuck to bed or something along the lines.
What about weekends? How much were you playing then?
Yes, pretty much. If I was alone, let's say my parents were somewhere else, I would just wake up early morning. I would specifically wake up early so I could play more, and I would play until I pretty much passed out.
How long did this behavior go on for?
The whole time I played WoW back then, so it was around from the middle of Burning Crusade until the start of Cataclysm. So I don't know the years, but that's how long.
You mentioned you'd fight with your brothers and sisters because there was only one computer in the house. Was it just a bit of yelling and screaming, or did it ever become a bit more than that?
There was definitely a lot of yelling. It was different. I used to, when my brother was on the computer, I used to punch his back. I don't know, it started as being come on, let me on the computer, come on, don't be like that. And I just started hitting harder and harder until I could actually hurt him.
Was there any one moment that stood out as a moment that you felt you might have crossed a line with your level of play at all?
Yes. It was the time that I had been really bad terms with my brothers for a while. Like, we had fought a lot. And I don't know, he said something that, like, crossed the line in my head, and I tried to hurt him really bad.
Did that end up happening?
No, it didn't. Like, I tried, but he ran into the bedroom and closed the door, and I just calmed down and I channeled my anger into some couch pillows.
Was there any kind of fallout from that incident?
Yes, I got sent to the anger management therapy for a while.
Through therapy, was how much you were playing WoW addressed?
Yes, it was pretty much only about WoW, and we actually came to the conclusion that I probably shouldn't play this game.
What did you do to try to tackle the issue from there?
I had to, because my mother actually, I don't know the word in English, but she restricted all my movement. Like, she just said that you're not allowed to use the computer. Like, you're not allowed to do anything. Like, you just go outside and play like a kid should.
Out of interest, are you still playing the game now?
Actually, yes, I'm at the moment actually during this interview.
So, how often do you play now?
Quite a lot. I have a girlfriend now, and I have a job, and things like adults should have. And I don't know. I play a lot, but I tend to play other games than WoW as well.
Are you happy now with the way in which you balance both life and the game?
I'd say so, yeah. Like, I know that the difference between the past and today is that when I feel like not playing, then I can just quit. Like, back then I couldn't. Like, even if I felt like, oh, I'm so bored, there's nothing else to do. Like, there's always something to do in WoW. Like, I can always level a new alt or something. But now if I actually feel bored, I'm just gonna hit up a friend or something.
Having gone through what you did, what advice would you have for anyone hearing this who might be wondering if they're playing the game too much?
The main thing that I noticed that I actually, I couldn't think about anything else than WoW. Like, I know it's different between everyone, but I was, when I slept, I dreamt about WoW. When I was at school, only thing I thought about is, how many hours until I can go home to play WoW. But it just, when you realize that 90% of your thoughts are surrounding this one single game, then it's probably time to do something.
Okay, well, thanks so much for calling in, Kaleva. I really appreciate you sharing all of that with us.
No, thank you.
Okay, we've got another listener on the line now, and who are we talking to, and where in the world are you calling from?
I am the MGTOW Neat, and I am calling in from California.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for calling. Now, you contacted me just today, actually. I've been sitting around getting the latest episode ready, and now that's all done, I was chatting to you, and you approached me and said that you wanted to chat about something that I brought up on the show recently about mental health. And a lot of people have gotten back to me about that one, saying that they go through similar issues and they appreciated basically a little bit of a chat on that topic. So you contacted me and said that I presume you heard the episode as well, and you wanted to perhaps discuss some of the issues that you've gone through and the way in which you've dealt with them within World of Warcraft. Is that correct?
Yeah, or what WoW means and what it offers for people struggling to get through the day, and who struggle with mental illness and all that.
You mentioned a few things that you'd been dealing with for your lifetime, and what are some of those issues, if you're comfortable with telling the listeners?
Yeah, sure thing. So I deal with basically mostly trauma-related stuff. It's like depression, anxiety. The biggest one I kind of noticed was I think I have C complex PTSD, learning disability, which I had when I was younger, still kind of do. Had to go to special classes, non-hyper ADD or ADHD. I keep getting them confused. mild agoraphobia I used to have, which actually does kind of go hand in hand with a lot of MMO players sometimes, or they like to escape with MMOs.
That's the one thing actually that I did want to touch on that I haven't had much experience, the sort of agoraphobia. And it's interesting that you say that it's something that's not necessarily uncommon for MMO gamers. Have you spoken to people, or do you know of the fact that this is something that's a little bit prevalent within the community? Like, I'm going to say, obviously, like just a minority of people might suffer from.
Yeah, I really do think that that is possible. It's very common for. It seems like a lot of people who are depressed and they do have some kind of agoraphobia, or they like to shut in. Some that are introverted, although that's not really, meshed in with mental illness. A lot of those people do like to kind of retreat into like online worlds. Sometimes it's a forum, sometimes it's social media, but usually it is MMOs. They do kind of like bridge that gap to reality in the social sense. Of course, like, if they're playing MMOs, they're not really in reality that much, and they're trying to kind of get away from like the real world in a sense. And that does sound kind of negative, but for them it can be positive, and it is positive depending on your perspective, I guess you could say.
And what kind of experiences did you have personally? You use that word retreat, as you do retreat into an online fantasy world, I guess, when you play the game. But for you personally, did you find it to be a benefit or a detriment with dealing with the mental health issues that you have been dealing with?
It seems to me like MMOs get this like really bad rap, that like because it is an activity you can spend a lot of time on, and although Blizzard does make it addicting to do a lot of things sometimes, like now in retail, of course, there's a lot of activities where they do keep you kind of grinding, and they do try to keep you in the game and stuff as much as possible. It seems that some people do kind of like replace their social life with World of Warcraft because they don't want to deal with the outside world. But I don't really think it's a detriment that much, because like for me personally, when I got started on MMOs, my first one was Final Fantasy XI. I already was kind of shut in already. And so it was like, okay, you spend time doing something else, or, spend a lot of time on this game. I don't think it's healthy to spend too much time on the game, like over 40 hours a week if you have mental illness. But I can also see how it helps people, cope with their daily problems. If World of Warcraft does help you cope with like reality, and it's so bad and you're suicidal or you're near that point, you do what you gotta do to get through your day, unfortunately.
And when you say you do what you gotta do, is that the escape to Warcraft that you're referencing?
Yeah, but yes, of course. But the thing is that you don't really need World of Warcraft to escape, because, people will replace that with other things like, older generations. They'll replace that with, alcoholism and gambling, spending a lot of time in the casino. They're still kind of retreating into their mind in a sense. And so I think it's like people just come across the game and they're already looking for something to escape to. And because it's like a virtual world, they think that like, it's going to make their life better, or, they don't know how to make the real life better. So they just, they kind of just stay in there, and they kind of like wait for things to change, or, they just go on with life and use that world to cope, I guess.
So have you found that, have you developed any relationships with the game? When you used that term shut in earlier, have you developed relationships within the game and used that kind of benefit of the social aspect of World of Warcraft to help you in any way, sort of feel a little bit less shut in and come out of your shell a little bit?
I think people do kind of replace. Yeah, they kind of do. But I think a lot of them don't really care if they do get real world social interaction eventually. I think they kind of replace the real world interaction with like an online one. Like if you're lonely and, you don't know where to find someone. That's usually why sometimes people do get into online relationships, in that case. And so, it's like, no one wants to deal with me. No one wants to talk to me about my problems. I can't seem to find anyone. I can't connect with anyone. It's not always easy to go up to someone in the street and like trying to connect with someone. So what do? You're already in this game, like leveling away, grinding away. Probably better just to talk to that random orc warrior who's grinding right next to you or in the same dungeon, than someone on the street.
In moments when you mentioned before, if you, so to speak, have a bad day, if you are having a pretty bad day, do you find that you often do immediately reach to Warcraft as number one, as some kind of, I don't want to say medication, but something to placate you if you are feeling a bit emotional, or do you go to other things first? How would you say that you use the game in moments of strife?
Well, I do think that all those activities, inside activities where you're alone, they're all underneath the hedonism spectrum. And so if you don't want to, think about the real world, if you want to like kind of take your mind off of your problems or the way you're feeling, and if no one's around to help you out, then it's kind of like a drug. It's like the first thing you think of is that one game that gives you a lot of hours. And some people just play WoW or some other kind of video game to kind of pass the time, so you don't think about like doing something stupid, like hurting yourself. You don't want to think about like your life and your future and things like that. But there are some people who are really, really lonely and do have a lot of stuff to deal with, and so they try to actually like seek out relationships in the game, so they don't have to find them in real life, or they just don't know how to once.
Would you say that it's a great thing that you found MMO gaming to help you through some of the things that you deal with? Or do you sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't become a gamer and what you would be doing with your time?
Well, the only advantage MMOs have over other activities where you are kind of shut away from the world is that there is a social aspect to it. And then, of course, there's all these anti-MMO types who claim that like it's an addiction, it's this and that. There are people who take it way too serious, and they do play way too much. But it's like if they're already depressed, suicidal, they don't want to deal with the real world, they're going to be doing something else besides WoW in that free time. So it's either, I think to me, it's either 14 hours of World of Warcraft, or it's, 14 hours of, alcohol in your living room, or like, another couple hours of like, a console game like Call of Duty, or what other kind of, destructive or non-destructive, habits you can get into. Again, video games are only destructive if you're really falling down and, you're ignoring like your responsibility.
Would you have any advice for anyone who may be feeling that they're going through a hard time, or they're a bit unsure, or they're perhaps misdiagnosed, or just having a lot of bad days and not really sure what's going on, in terms of if they are simply just turning to gaming, or through your experiences, what would you say to people who are going through perhaps what you've gone through?
That's a really, really tough one. The cliche, like, if you have like children, if you have responsibilities, make sure those are getting taken care of. Don't let these games drag you down. But if you are spending a lot of time in these games, and you do feel like you're trying to get away from something, that I think maybe you do need to get some kind of help. Or you can always reach out to some kind of professional help, because, at the end of the day, World of Warcraft, or, getting your mage to 60, or getting full tier 2, or, getting a Shikandi or some other great weapon, it's not going to get rid of your problems and your mental health. And, you're on WoW for a long time usually because of something else or something that happened to you. So, if that's what you're doing, then maybe it's time for a journey of self-discovery, I think.
I agree, and I just want to say thank you so much for calling in today, MG Tonete, and I really do appreciate you being so open with me and to the listeners of the show. Thank you so much again for calling in and talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
Hi everyone, me again. Now that all those calls are done on that topic, I just want to reiterate something that you just heard. If you feel as though you would like to talk further about any of the issues raised in those calls, please do not be shy in contacting me or the callers that you just heard, or members of the Countdown to Classic Discord. The WoW community is an amazingly supportive one, and many people are readily available to help should you need any kind of help or information. I just want to say thank you again to everyone who called in today, especially appreciating that many of those calls got quite personal at times. So I really would encourage listeners to reach out in the Discord to those callers to thank them for sharing their stories with us in that fashion. It really did mean a lot to me, and thank you again. Now it's time to take a trip back to the forums as we do here on Countdown to Classic, and I'll be slightly mixing things up for this version of Forum and Fauna, as it will come with an accompanying listener call. That call is with listener of the show and previous Countdown to Classic caller, Ohgee, who is all for the inclusion of the old school spell batching in World of Warcraft Classic. So with that, now it's time for Forum and Fauna. As we do things here on Forum and Fauna, we should provide an argument for both sides of the coin. So I'll go through about 5 dissenting posts all in a row here, and then finish off with Ohgee's call to bring on home the argument for spell batching. So, what is spell batching? Some people are still unfamiliar with the term, and I must admit, I hadn't heard of it up until about 2 months ago either, even though I knew of the phenomenon that I colloquially call double sheeping. I just didn't know the finer points of it. I tried to define it on the show recently, but for today, I found the following post, which I think has done the best job of simplifying things. And we turn to WoW Classic subreddit user Myers99 for this definition of spell batching. So think of it this way. You have a metronome that ticks every second, and let's say every time it ticks is when the server executes everything that happened between all the users in a PvP battle. Back when vanilla was live, there were network limitations, which meant that how often this metronome ticked had to have a bit of a delay. So if two mages queued up polymorph at the same time on each other, they could both get sheeped. Because let's say mage number 1 ends his cast at 1.2 seconds, but mage number 2 ends his cast at 1.6 seconds. With spell batching, at every second they would both happen at the same time at 2 seconds. But with tighter spell batching, like on retail, mage number 1 would get his sheep off before mage number 2 because the window is much smaller. So that's spell batching, except in vanilla, the window, or the time between the proverbial metronome ticks, was said to be 400 milliseconds. So let's start with the anti-spell batching post, with user Ohgee, who says this. I'm fairly satisfied with spell batching removal. There's not much skill-based about it, mostly luck. The average player doesn't have a 0.4 of a second or under reaction time, so there's obviously no room for counterplay. If you counterspell a fear cast, it shouldn't go off. If you kick a fear, you shouldn't be feared with your kick on cooldown. I don't think those are healthy interactions. Mostly rage-inducing, that's bullshit. He silenced me while stunned kind of stuff. Really productive meta. I don't know anything about the non-batch system, if it favors low ping players or any other possible negatives, so I'm not going to defend it, but I can say there's nothing profound about batching and nothing to be gained by the vast majority of players. I read before that batching negatively impacted healing in raids as well. If your tank took lethal damage in a 0.4 of a second window, he would die regardless of how much healing he received. Nothing but an uncontrollable, rage-inducing clown fiesta. So, what that poster is saying is that World of Warcraft is not a game populated by twitchy first-person shooter players for the most part, and even if most people wanted to be that kind of Twitch-responsive player, they would likely not be able to be that due to such a small window of that 0.4 seconds of reaction time. Thus, it's not like twitchy players are a dime a dozen amongst the player base. The results of spell batching are keyboards going through monitors as people scream, "That's not fair! They shouldn't have been able to do that!" Notably, and this is the only time we'll really touch on it as it's not spoken about, but perhaps something just as important to keep in mind, there were PvE ramifications behind spell batching as well. As stated, wipes could still happen in spite of you getting off that awesome last millisecond heal, as you may still simply just miss the batch window. Yes, you sent the spell out in time technically, but the server didn't receive it. So your hero moment unfortunately winds up being a zero moment. Could this possibly have been Blizzard's intent? Or were they simply held back by technological limitations at the time? Spoiler alert, it was purely a technical limitation. But now let's hear from user CaroTwin, who says this. I'm fairly indifferent about this, but I think a lot of the arguments about high-end PvP depending on batching are disingenuous. You're asking for a faithful replication of something that is basically a bug in intent. Further, regardless of intent, in practice it actually reduces the skill ceiling because for every gouge a blink pro move, there's the way more common situation of enemy gets a CC off even though it got clearly interrupted moment. For PvPers who are good enough to do the former, my experience is that the latter is way more frustrating. I don't think there's anything wrong with a lower skill ceiling, as vanilla PvP wasn't supposed to be League of Legends, and in turn it prioritizes strategy over micro. But the idea that PvP would be substantially worse without batching is a huge stretch. It's good for the community to bring it to the devs' attention, but as someone who PvP'd at the highest levels, I completely disagree that the vanilla experience depends on its inclusion. So this poster asks the question, if it wasn't something that was desired by Blizzard when the game was designed, and was purely a result of technical limitations, and it could be fixed now, then why would you want to keep it in the game? Perhaps that description of it being akin to a bug isn't that far off the mark. They would have fixed it if they could have, so why not let them for the best as opposed to the most authentic classic experience? Uh-oh, dangerous territory here. Everyone just shifted a little in their seats, I bet. This has been an argument that has raged over the past year. Do we want classic to be the best it can be, or the most authentic it can be? I know many people who would say that the most authentic version is the best version. Do we want new Coke with that new and improved recipe, or is it the case that the spell batching element of the old recipe was part of what made it awesome? And hand me a classic Coke, you crazy person, no one liked new Coke. Another great hypothetical arose in that user's post. Would the PvP system actually be worse with spell batching looking more like the retail version of the game? We know that we want authenticity, and mages polymorphing each other at the same time was part of vanilla. But if we actually stopped to think about doing it the other way around, would it improve things? Well, it would result in spells actually working as intended, in terms of rewarding the mage, in that previous example, who actually casts the spell 1/10 of a second before their opponent. So would that be considered better, or just more as intended? Let's move on to the next post from user Ohgee, who tells us the following. Again, Ohgee, twice. The only people I see complaining and providing examples are rogues, and even more specifically in PvP. A class that is already top tier in PvP, and I don't see spell batching being removed as their fall from grace. The disrupts game balance argument is mostly an exaggeration that does the average player dirty. When a rogue kicks a warlock who's casting fear and kick goes on cooldown but you're running around feared anyway, that's just an antiquated system. Furthermore, now over the years it has become the norm to abuse this system. It's a hard sell for me to believe gouging a blink is nothing more than mainstreamed mechanics abuse. Wall jumping was abused in the same way, especially in Warsong Gulch. Blizzard deemed that an abusive exploitation and is removing wall jumping for Classic. Maybe. In both examples of batching and wall jumping, there are some good things that come out of it, but the bad outweighs the good. The preservation argument works for any potential change, but there's also people who want all major cities to be perpetual graveyards from corrupted blood spreading, or no add-ons allowed ever, who are also advocating for no changes. You just have to draw your own line. So this poster implores us to quit living in the past and embrace the wave of the future. But they also give us the following points to chew on. Exploits and the abuse of game mechanics. Yes, the game allows you to do it, but it wasn't much of an intention in the designer's mind, and thus could be deemed to be somewhat of an abuse of gameplay by PvPers. Many people were sad to see that wall jumping could potentially be going the way of the dodo, as we were never meant to go and explore almost all corners of the world through that exploit, despite being able to actually do it in-game. Shouldn't spell batching fall under the same category? That's why you might want to brace yourself for seeing it go away too. At what point does #NoChanges start to become detrimental to the Classic project? And without dragging it back into changes versus no changes too much, does there have to be a line in the sand where certain changes should be welcomed by the community to have the game played as intended? Again, you all know I lean no changes. I'm just putting up this argument for the other side here. So we'll move along quickly to the next user, Dragon Adept, who says this. With authentic 2004 internet connections, I think for most World of Warcraft players, it would have been literally impossible to exploit batching to gouge a blink or whatever. Sure, somebody probably had a T1 line to their house which was down the road from Blizzard servers and could pull it off, but for someone on dial-up overseas, that wasn't happening. You might pull it off by predicting what the other player would do and getting lucky with everyone's lag and the batching, but not reliably. As others have said, getting an advantage out of exploiting the batching delay is an un-Blizz-like result of people exploiting 2004 era code with 2018 era low latency internet connections. Yet again, this is a case of private server players demanding Blizzard give them an official private server, not a genuine effort to recreate vanilla World of Warcraft as it was really played. So this user ponders further. Could the effective use of spell batching be put down to luck or skill? Or was it a combination of the two? How much of the high-end PvP play truly was prediction-based versus reflex-based? Small tangent alert. I had an interesting thought in wondering whether or not an expertly pulled off prediction-based play in PvP was in fact skill or luck. And in my mind, it's the perfect combination of both. It's skillful to know what abilities may be used in certain situations by other classes, and then to use an ability of your own that counters it. However, taking the gamble that it is about to happen in that exact moment is also somewhat based in luck and probability. Now, for anyone who's up in arms about that conclusion, let me equate it to heading to the horse track for the day. If I were to have a successful outing betting on race after race at the track, the argument is that I've used the powers of analysis and deduction to amount to being a skillful gambler, a term which in and of itself seems quite the incongruity. However, I've still also been the beneficiary of some luck in the results. Another horse may have blocked the path of other potential winners. Perhaps another horse broke down during the race that may well have gone on to win. Some chance still comes into play. You're playing the odds, which hopefully are ever in your favor. So I would surmise that high-end PvP play is a bit of both luck and skill when trying to predict a play in order to effectively counter it. By all means though, if you do disagree with me, please do write or call into the show, as I'd be more than happy to go further down that interesting rabbit hole. But back to the poster, and we hear that term invoked of un-Blizz-like, which I must admit I find somewhat ironic in that it was a system implemented by Blizzard themselves. But again, we have this argument of what Blizzard did versus what they wanted to do. Is it an exploit if one takes advantage of the fact that they have low latency and the larger spellbatching windows of vanilla at their disposal in Classic? I honestly don't think so, and believe the use of the word exploit is a bit of a stretch here. But I'm still arguing against spellbatching, so let me jump back on that train. Yeah, private server players are just trying to screw us honest folk over here. You just want spellbatching so you can have a little utopia that is an official private server and continue to use all your little tricks that you've been using for years to continue to bully people. This is bullshit, or words to that effect. Anyway, on to the final post for the anti-spellbatchers from user Soulscream, who says this. Okay, with this fucking thing getting traction now, I've lurked enough. Fuck all you spellbatching fans. Spellbatching does not award skill. It lowers the skill cap. It is antithetical to the principles of vanilla World of Warcraft, which is outplaying your opponent in a chess game. It's a technical limitation, and if the technology could have catered better at the time, it never would have been implemented. It 1000% goes against the spirit of the game. For fuck's sake, I know it existed in vanilla, but of all the silly things to try and grasp onto, fucking spellbatching? You stupid motherfuckers championing this idea want second-rate reactive PvP rather than real skill where you need to be a step ahead of your opponent. Fucking hell, hashtag sad, hashtag bad. The basis for my argument is that an MMO like World of Warcraft does not have manual targeting of spells. It has global cooldowns. The gameplay is nothing like a first-person shooter where targeting and super fast gameplay matters. What matters is strategy rather than twitch. If your ping plus reaction time is below the spellbatching threshold, basically any modern PC and internet connection, this rewards Twitch gameplay. My argument is that MMOs should not be about Twitch gameplay. It's about planning, trading cooldowns, global cooldowns, cast times, positioning, basically the chess game I mentioned above. Using Twitch gameplay to counter a move rather than a strategic counter move is unrewarding for both players. Winning with superior strategy feels good, and losing to something based on Twitch does not feel good. Not in an MMO, anyway. I don't believe intentionally implementing an aged feature that rewards Twitch gameplay is good for World of Warcraft PvP. Okay, listen up. This poster is coming in hot. As they say, this is chess, not checkers, people. PvP is about planning ahead and outplaying. Not about reacting to the fact that you were just outplayed because you still have a third of a second to rip off an ability to save yourself from the fact that you couldn't see something coming. You're moving the goalposts. That's just not cricket, as we say here in Australia. Meaning, even though you might be technically playing within the bounds of the rules, you're not really playing the game as it should be played. Why are you trying to turn World of Warcraft into a first-person shooter style game? It should be all about strategy, not fast twitch fibers. Now, with all those posts done, and to be fair to Ohgee, in the face of the many comments of dissent there, let's lead Ohgee in softly and warm him up with one post in the pro-spell batching argument. And that's this one from user Cathalxo, who says this. People who don't realize how crucial the old spell batching system was for PvP are so clueless. It really is sad reading a lot of these comments. Many of the particularly skilled plays you could pull off were fundamentally dependent on this system. Gouging Blink is a perfect example. Blinding Charge is another one. Also, kicking the end of a war stomp followed by an immediate cast. Hell, pre-kicking itself for Christ's sake. In later expansions, stuff like blinding a shadow dance, shadow step, cheap shot, shadow stepping a charge, and I'm just listing a handful of rogue plays because that's what I played. These were high risk, high reward plays that only the really skilled players could pull off consistently. Anyone who knows anything about PvP knows that this system involved a higher skill cap. People talking about how these types of things were just random or luck-based, or how they made for a sluggish experience, are just so clueless to pre-WoD PvP that it's honestly cringeworthy. Changing this system would be a huge letdown, and as a PvPer may cause me personally to reconsider playing the game altogether. If you think that's overreacting, then I am almost completely certain you are clueless about the implications for PvP. Dueling, for example, was a big part of vanilla, and these types of skilled plays were most prevalent in 1v1 scenarios. Back then, you had fewer complex abilities at your disposal compared to some subsequent expansions, so pulling off spell batching plays were what allowed you to really stand out in terms of skilled gameplay. Removing this system removes a portion of the skill aspect and changes the feel of the game for anyone actually skilled enough to use the system to his or her advantage. I would actually be surprised if they didn't implement the old spell batching system, as it would be a huge change to a game they vowed to keep as close to the original as possible. So as this poster suggests, Classic was not necessarily as complex as some people may believe it to be when it comes to high-end PvP play. There were only so many abilities you were going to use with each class. The extra element that spell batching brings into play just helps deepen the complexity a little bit. It's the pepper on top of the meal that it wouldn't be the same without. It required a shitload of skill to pull off well. And why are we sitting here denouncing twitchy competitive players like they're not skillful? It's a video game. The PvP isn't stagnant. This isn't Hearthstone where we can sit and plan. War is chaos and waits for nobody. There are moving parts running around everywhere, and Twitch plays should be rewarded and definitely a part of the gameplay. There are simply too many instances where effective use of it can come into play. It's not all just double sheep. But now with all that out there, let's finally get to Ohgee's call as he chats all about the spell batching issue and explains further on why spell batching should absolutely be in Classic. All right, we've got another Countdown to Classic listener on the line, and it's a return caller, someone I'm very happy to be speaking to again. Ohgee, what's up, man?
Hey, how are you, man? Glad to be back on the show. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, mate. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Now, it's funny because in saying that, talking to you again, I feel like I've been talking to you anyway because you're actually, you're one of those names that I do see popping up on the subreddit quite a bit. And usually on, I don't dive into every, thread on the subreddit, but the ones that are sort of the most intriguing, I do happen to see your name popping up. And obviously they're usually PvP related because that's your jam. But you've raised a few topics recently that have gotten you a little bit riled up, and that one such topic that we're talking about right now is the concept of spell batching, and it sort of just came from nowhere. Like, this just blew up with people talking about it. Now, one thing I'd ask about you is, I actually don't know, was this something that was noticed in the demo that people suddenly freaked out about?
This was something, that was noticed in the demo. I didn't notice it myself in the demo, but, while the demo was still happening within a couple of days, I noticed that it was one of the things people were talking about. At the time, though, at that time that the demo was actually live, there was so much conversation about sharding, and everyone was so concerned with sharding, that a lot of other things sort of didn't get as much attention. So, like I said, I didn't notice a lack of spell batching myself because it's something that's difficult to notice when you're only really fighting mobs and, they're lower level mobs that don't have a lot of abilities. So I didn't notice it myself, but I did see it get brought up, I think on day 2 or 3 of the demo, but it kind of got glossed over because everyone was, had their pitchforks in their hands, with sharding. So, I think it sort of flew under the radar, the whole spell batching thing. And I was actually working on a video about my thoughts on the demo, and spell batching was a huge thing that I wanted to talk about. And then the day before I had that video ready, I actually saw the forum post by XJum, and that forum post got a lot of traction on the Blizzard website as well as Reddit. So I think that forum post is really what kind of started the conversation and made everyone sort of aware of it. Because at this point, the sharding stuff had mostly blown over. And so I thought, this is great. This is perfect timing. I can get my video out. Like, hopefully a conversation about this will really get started. 24 hours or so after my video, Alex Sensual, who's, a pretty big guy with a lot of subscribers, he put out a video about it as well. I saw Tips Out, who, he's another guy with a lot more subs than me. I saw him mentioning it. So, I was glad I could be a part of kind of starting that conversation. And it did sort of blow up. And I think when everyone, hopefully saw my video examples, and then a lot more people even heard, their favorite content creators talking about it, I think it got things going. And I actually saw a tweet from Tips Out, saying that he had some information that Blizzard well aware of it and that they were looking into a way to replicate it. We can get more into that later, but yeah.
Yep, for sure. I did hear about that as well, that Blizzard have acknowledged obviously that they're looking into it, whatever that may mean. Now, I think they released a post on Reddit as well. I got word of it from a Blizzard member in a Discord that they've acknowledged it. They said, yep, the Classic team knows about it. They're looking into it. And again, that doesn't mean that anything's been done. It's just, at least we know that they're not ignorant to the issues that the community is discussing. But we'll take it all the way back to the start, because I guess we can't just presume that every man and his dog, or every woman and her dog, know what spell batching is. So, if I can just get you to explain, because I was asked about this recently, I think in a call last week, and I fucking butchered it. I gave a horrible explanation. But perhaps you, in all your PvP wisdom, can be able to succinctly describe for the average player, what is spell batching?
Well, I think I can. I'll do my best.
Mm-hmm.
I want to preface everything with a little bit of a disclaimer here. I do not have very much knowledge about networking. I am not like a quote unquote computer person. Like, for a gamer, my abilities and my knowledge of that stuff is pretty limited. So, if there is somebody that's listening that has networking experience, I hope I don't make them cringe, or I hope I don't say anything that's too incorrect.
They'll rage quit the podcast.
Yeah. So please understand, I'm not a networking guy. I don't claim to have networking knowledge, but I do believe that I have a pretty firm grasp on this issue. So spell batching refers to actions performed by players or by NPCs, honestly, being processed by the server in batches, in groups. So during Vanilla, Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King, Cataclysm, and Mists of Pandaria, so all the way up until Warlords of Draenor, World of Warcraft used spell batching. And the spell batch system that they used basically processed a request every 400 ms. So there's a post from a blue here that I'll read on the blue tracker of Wowhead. This is from 2014. So this is from around when WoD came out and spell batching was drastically changed. So he says, I was wondering when this get brought up. I've hinted about this in a couple of interviews. Yes, there was a very significant underlying change here that may have implications for theory crafting. Again, I'm quoting a blue poster from Blizzard here. I don't want to get too deep into the under the hood workings of WoW servers, but here's a super short version. Any action that one unit takes on another different unit is processed in a batch every 400 ms. Some very attentive people may have noticed that healing yourself would give you the health instantly, whereas healing another player would incur a delay of between 0 and 400 ms. The same with damaging, applying auras, interrupting, knocking back, etc. So that's straight from the horse's mouth. End quote. That's a blue poster saying that 400 ms is the batch, the way batching was implemented. What this means, again, if my very basic networking knowledge is accurate, what this basically means is that there was a server tick there were 2.5 server ticks every 1 second. So when you start to talk about tick rate refers to how many times per second server sends information as far as what's happening. So the state of the game can change in between ticks. And so different games need different tick rates. For example, CSGO is most commonly played on 64 tick servers. So this means that 64 times per second, the server takes a snapshot of the state of the game. Competitive Counter-Strike matches are played on, I'm trying to blank now. I think it's 120.
Jesus.
144, something like that.
Oh, wow.
Higher tick servers. So it's over 100 times per second that the server is taking a snapshot of what's happening in the game. Now, in MMOs, that would be overkill. Another game, Overwatch, operates at a 60 tick rate. And Overwatch players actually complain about that and want higher tick rates for the servers because it's a shooter. But in an MMO, those tick rates would be astronomically too high because there are so many actions being performed in an MMO, all, in a zone or in the whole world or whatever it might be. You need a lower tick rate. So this 400 ms that this blue poster said is what they used. That would be, again, a tick rate of 2.5 ticks per second. So that means that 2.5 times per second, the game takes a snapshot of what's happening and applies, whatever happened in the previous tick. So this mechanic and these spells being processed in groups, in batches, every time the server ticks, that is what let you sort of trade abilities in old school Warcraft. Again, all the way up until Warlords of Draenor. You could, two mages could sheep each other. You could gouge a mage on their blink. That's probably the most famous and most well-known example of spell batching, is when you gouge a mage, right? When he blinks, he'll use his blink and it'll go on cooldown and he'll move, 14 yards or whatever, but he'll be gouged. And the server basically counts both abilities as a hit because they were in the same batch. So beginning in Warlords of Draenor, the server tick rate got way increased and it began to process abilities in the immediate order they were performed. So you couldn't do stuff like gouge blinks anymore. And so the end result, sort of consequence of all of this, is that a lot of the most beloved sort of quirky PvP tricks from vanilla are not possible without spell batching. And it's sort of difficult to really get a handle on what I'm saying. I don't want to just blatantly self-promote, but I do have a video up with some really clear examples to show you the exact kind of instances I'm talking about where spell batching is a huge deal.
Yeah, no, go for it. Absolutely. I recommend people to go and check out your channel. And it's not just that video. If you are interested in PvP and the mechanics behind PvP play and hardcore PvP play at all, then please do go and check out Ohgee's channel on YouTube. And this particular video obviously was very informative. So no, please feel free to plug away. But we'll get into a little bit of the issues behind whether or not, spell batching matters. Now, this is something that you've been very, very adamant about, that this stuff matters. And it's actually become quite a divisive topic. A lot of people are saying, look, man, they've blatantly said that it was never supposed to be this way. This was due to technical limitations on the servers back in the day. That's the only reason this happened. And then obviously they addressed it later on through WoD, like you said, and now it's the norm. So, they're just correcting it. They're doing it as it should have been. What do you have to say to that?
Well, that's the only counter argument that I ever see get brought up. And the fact of the matter is that the technology so the system they used from WoD onward, that technology existed well before they implemented it. And you can actually find blue posts and places where Blizzard sources have mentioned that spell batching was, quote, left in the game because of positive effect it had on gameplay. That's a quote, positive effect on gameplay. You can find that as well. I believe that was linked by XJum in the forum post that sort of started this whole conversation. Mm-hmm. But yeah, spell batching was left in the game because it had a positive effect on gameplay. It was in the game in TBC and Wrath of the Lich King arenas, which I think most people consider sort of the pinnacle of arena gameplay. Wrath of the Lich King was definitely when arena was at its most competitive. It was on the MLG Pro circuit. It was one of the bigger esports at that time, sort of 2008, 2009. And at that time, spell batching was in the game. Technology existed to not necessarily need it, but they left it in the game.
Okay. Let me read you this one for a bit of and again, I'm not particularly invested in either of these arguments. I lean towards your argument because, no changes and all that jazz. And, but the thing is, I wasn't a mad PvPer. I plan to PvP more, but whatever I get will sort of be like the first experience for me because I wasn't a hardcore PvP player. Like, I'm not very fucking good either. None of this stuff really matters to me, but I completely accept that if you are very good at PvP, this stuff matters. So, but, as we do here, I'll push back on your points a little bit, all in good fun and just sort of test your argument. So I'll read you a post from user Ohgee over at the WoW Classic subreddit who says this. I'm fairly satisfied with spell batching removal. There's not much skill based about it, mostly luck. The average player doesn't have a 0.4 millisecond or under reaction time, so there's obviously no room for counterplay. If you counterspell a fear cast, it shouldn't go off. If you kick a fear, you shouldn't be feared with your kick on cooldown. I don't think those are healthy interactions. Mostly rage inducing. That's bullshit. He silenced me while stunned. Really productive meta. I don't know anything about the non-batch system if it favors low ping players or any other possible negatives, so I'm not going to defend it, but I can say there's nothing profound about batching and nothing to be gained by the vast majority of players. What do you reckon?
Well, I'm glad that he brought up reaction time because that's actually something that I have been wanting to talk about. Almost all human beings have a extremely similar reaction. The fact that, certain people are better at games because they have a better reaction time, especially in WoW, I think is a big time myth because it's really way more about predicting than it is about reacting. Mm-hmm. So what's spelled, obviously, there are exceptions, like the best gamers in the world that play on stages for millions and millions of dollars. Those guys have a way better reaction time than you or me, most likely. But when I say way better, I'm talking about like 10 to 15 MS. Almost all human beings have a reaction time pretty much within the same range of 50 to 60 MS. Anything outside of that are extreme outliers. Most people's reaction time is similar enough that you're not going to notice it in like a fervor tick, for example. So all of that being said, what spell batching does is it gives you a slightly wider window to land like a successful prediction, if that makes sense. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, for example, let's say a rogue and a warlock are fighting. The rogue cheap shots the warlock in his opener. Warlocks can't trinket stuns in vanilla. So usually when a warlock is sitting in a stun, 90% of average warlocks, even the good ones, in most situations, you're going to be spamming your death coil so that as soon as that stun ends, you can coil that rogue off you and fear him and get a little bit of control. So in a spell batching scenario, the rogue has a window of one server tick, which again is 400 ms, a little bit less than half of a second. He has a 0.4 second window to try and land a vanish within 0.4 seconds of that death coil. And if he successfully does that, the death coil goes on cooldown, but he avoids it and he's in stealth. So without spell batching, that window shrinks immensely, and it's going to be much, much more difficult, borderline impossible, for that warlock to vanish the death coil if it's at close range. Some people that death coil might not have been the best example because that's a spell that actually has to travel to you before it applies the debuff. But speaking at close range, if there's spell batching, then you have a 0.4 second window, sort of say, you have your finger on the key, you think he's going to do this, and then, he's going to coil right here, here it is, and you hit your vanish key, you have a 0.4 second window, as opposed to, needing to be 1,000% perfect for it to work, if that makes sense. So it's going to make some plays impossible, like gouging blinks, that will not be possible. And it'll make other plays immensely more difficult, such as vanishing death coils. But either way, it's really more about taking away the window of time that you have to make a prediction, to like push a key based on a prediction that you've made mentally, if that makes sense.
All right, absolutely. Well, look, to be fair to you, mate, I've given you a post before that sort of was anti your argument, but I've got one now that is pro your argument. I might ask you to extrapolate upon it or explain it a bit further if you can once I'm done. A little bit of a long one, but listen up to this one because you might get a kick out of this one. So this is from user Cathalxo at the subreddit, who says, people who don't realize how crucial the old spell batching system was for PvP are so clueless. It really is sad reading a lot of these comments. Many of the particularly skilled plays you could pull off were fundamentally dependent on this system. Gouging Blink is a perfect example. Blinding Charge is another one. Also kicking the end of a War Stomp followed by an immediate cast. Hell, pre-kicking itself, for Christ's sake. In later expansions, stuff like blinding a Shadow Dance, Shadow Step, Cheap Shot, Shadow Stepping a Charge, and I'm just listing a handful of rogue plays because that's what I played. These were high risk, high reward plays that only the really skilled players could pull off consistently. Anyone who knows anything about PvP knows that this system involved a higher skill cap. People talking about how these types of things were just random or luck based, or how they made for a sluggish experience, are just so clueless to pre-WoD PvP that it's honestly cringeworthy. Changing this system would be a huge letdown, and as a PvPer may cause me personally to reconsider playing the game altogether. If you think that's overreacting, then I am almost completely certain you are clueless about the implications for PvP. Dueling, for example, was a big part of vanilla, and these types of skilled plays were most prevalent in 1v1 scenarios. Back then, you had fewer complex abilities at your disposal compared to some subsequent expansions, so pulling off spellbatching plays were what allowed you to really stand out in terms of skilled gameplay. Removing this system removes a portion of the skill aspect and changes the feel of the game for anyone actually skilled enough to use this system to his or her advantage. I would actually be surprised if they didn't implement the old spell batching system, as it would be a huge change to a game they vowed to keep as close to the original as possible. So, Ohgee, I ask you, firstly, anything from that post that you'd like to touch on further? And also, when you talk about the rage from the PvP community, how would it change the meta in terms of, I know all the things you wouldn't be able to do anymore, but wouldn't like is there any part of the PvP community that would be like, well, it's exciting to maybe discover a new meta. We get to go through a whole new way of being the best. Or is it basically, no, it's too big of a change, I'm out?
Obviously, that mindset might exist with some people. If you hadn't played private servers, like if you hadn't touched vanilla since 2004, 2005, whatever, then you'd probably be, more likely to say, hey, that's exciting, sort of different, change the meta up a little bit. But I think anybody that's invested time playing on private servers and really, loves vanilla PvP, they will be offended if spell batching's not in the game. And that poster hit the nail on the head in a lot of ways. Obviously they're a little bit abrasive, saying that people that are against it are clueless. But I can't really disagree with their outlook there, if I'm being honest. So there's also a sort of myth. I talked about like reacting versus predicting, and how I think that a lot of plays think of as reaction plays are really more of a prediction play, and spell batching sort of facilitates that prediction style of play. But another sort of myth, I think, is that spell batching only matters at high levels of play. Most of the little tricks that I've sort of figured out myself in vanilla have been stuff that I figured out initially by doing it on accident. I'm playing a battleground, and something happens, two abilities sort of trade at the same time that I go, whoa, like that was crazy. Like one of the more recent things that I've done is like grenading a warrior on his charge. This was like within, I've played vanilla PvP for 6 years, and this was just within the past year. that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
I naded a warrior in the same server tick, like my nade threw in the same server tick as he charged. And so I jumped his charge, which is another spell batching thing. So this is like a double example. But anyway, so the end result is I'm up in the air while I'm in his charge stun out of his melee range, and he's sitting where his charge ended, but he's in a grenade stun. And that's just like a doubled up example of just the quirky mechanics. And again, that was something I did on accident. And so after that, I started, trying to nade warriors when I jumped their charges. So even if you're not like playing at a super high level, you'll notice spell batching just happen by coincidence. It'll just happen accidentally. And it creates these great little moments where you're like, whoa, like that's so vanilla. Like that's so great. And it makes you smile. At least if you're like me, it makes you smile. So it definitely is the most noticeable in duels. It definitely is the most noticeable with really skilled players that are playing mind games and trying to sort of predict each other constantly. But it will be noticed by everyone. It'll make the game just feel a little bit different, and it will remove those kind of quirky moments that not only happen when you watch unbelievable players dueling, but also happen just when you're, running around PvPing. They happen by accident. And it's just such a charming part of the game, in addition to being a big part of the skill cap.
Okay. Well, the last question I've got for you might be one that you're not able to answer, given, as you said, look, you're not experienced with servers. You don't know sort of the background to how some of this stuff is actually implemented. But I mean, the one thing that I keep coming back to that some other people might be wondering is it even an option for Blizzard? Can they do it the old way if they want to? Is it like, you pull up the old settings menu and just go, oh yeah, just change that to 400 milliseconds and bang, we're good to go? Or is it a bit more complicated than that?
You definitely don't need to be a rocket scientist to know it's not that simple. Nothing is that simple. I'm sure that it is a pretty involved process for them to try and replicate it. So, on one hand, I'm very glad that Blizzard is aware of it. I'm definitely happy that they are looking into trying to replicate spell batching. However, I am a little bit concerned if they sort of try to recreate it using a different method. In other words, assuming they're not able to just, throw classic on, servers with a 2.5 tick rate. And that fixes it, assuming they're not able to do something that simple. I would be a little bit worried about them trying to kind of reinvent the wheel, and recreate it, because then you always have the possibility that the end result of whatever they come up with to sort of mimic it isn't quite the same thing. And there can be unforeseen consequences. There could, if they do sort of create a spell batching 2.0 or sort of Frankenstein their way to a spell batching system, there's always the chance that we get to level 60, we start, really playing, and it's not quite what we had in mind, and it could, have broken things. So that makes me a little bit nervous, but I think it's good they're looking into it, and I think if there's any possible way they can implement it, that it's very important that they do. It needs a lot of play testing to make sure it's not going to screw up other things.
Mm. Well, look, we'll all be watching it and seeing what happens in the end. And I've no doubt the hardcore PvP community will be watching this like a hawk. We'll see what happens. I mean, I'm already getting shit from Patricia when I'm being tongue in cheek when I talk about going into the settings menu. She's going, settings menu, Josh, you idiot. Like, I know there's more to it than that. But look, we'll definitely keep an eye on what happens. And Ohgee, I hope it works out for you. As I said, I'm not particularly fussed, so I don't care what they do. Do whatever you want, Blizzard. Hashtag no changes, whatever. Whatever makes it good and keeps you happy.
I'm not somebody that's going to quit or like not play the game over it, but it is a big deal.
Okay. Mate, thanks so much for calling in and giving everyone that explanation. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back, Josh.
Now that's the segment done, and thanks again to Ohgee for being so readily available to come back on the show and discuss that divisive topic. If anyone is wondering what my thoughts are on the matter, well, whilst I'm somewhat ambivalent because I didn't PvP much back in the day, I do vouch for the pro spell batching camp. leave it in if you can. I really think it's akin to removing a bug or a glitch from a game retroactively that had a big impact on gameplay, such as animation cancelling in fighting games, rocket boosting in the Quake series, fire hopping in Mario Kart 8 for the Wii U. Think of the little tricks that you might use in an old Mario game that probably was against the spirit of the game itself, but that you still happily employed when replaying those favourite titles to this day. Again, not to suggest that spell batching is the same as a bug or a glitch exploit, but it's, for better or worse, something that was in the game that we learned to play around. Many people's skills were forged around this mechanic. Sure, they could go off and learn the new mechanics and probably still be the best at what they do, but keep the game as it was. It might be one of the moles on the face of Classic, but some would say it's not a mole. It's a beauty spot. Anyway, it's about time we talked Christmas, everyone, as it is the season for giving, and Countdown to Classic is no exception. So the show is doing a very special giveaway for the holiday season, and I'm very proud to announce Countdown to Christmas. It has been an amazing year for me personally and the show, and to show my appreciation, I organised for Santa to round up 2 pre-orders for digital downloads of Warcraft 3 Reforged. So, whenever that game releases, you could get it for free. Gratis, $0 dues. This is my way of saying thank you to you, the listeners, for all of your support of Countdown to Classic through 2018. So, how do you go in the running for this Christmas giveaway? Well, it's very easy. Just jump on Twitter, create an account if you have to, and do the following. Find my account, which is at Count2Classic with the number 2. So Count2Classic. Follow me, and that's important. A lot of people forget this part in competitions. You actually have to be following me. And after that, tag me in a tweet stating what your favorite episode of Countdown to Classic is of the 86 that we've done, and why. At the end of that tweet, throw in the hashtag CountdownToChristmas and actually spelling it out, none of this Xmas stuff, and you're all done. Easy, right? So, follow, mention, explain, and hashtag, and you're in the running for your free copy of Warcraft 3 Reforged, as Countdown to Classic wishes the fans a very Merry Christmas. You'll have until midnight on Christmas Eve, so get them into me by the end of December 24, and I'll announce a winner hopefully on Christmas Day, or whatever episode is around about then, to make the day just that little bit more awesome for a couple of much appreciated Countdown to Classic listeners. For all the beloved patrons of the show, I am extra thankful for your support. And so, if you enter as a patron, please PM me on Discord and let me know your Twitter handle, and it will count for 2 entries into the competition. So, as they say, you've got to be in it to win it, party people. Get those tweets flying and maybe score yourself a free copy of Warcraft 3 Reforged whenever Blizzard releases that one. So, that's the show for the day, everyone. Stay tuned next week as Countdown to Classic rounds into Christmas with a broad variety of listener calls and some more lore, with the story of the one, the only, Jaina Proudmoore. Now it's time for some thank yous, and a big thank you as always to patrons Connor C, Damien A, Eric L, Herbert, John H.C, Jamie S, Michael H, Minoru, Randall H, Tim B, Tim S, and Zudamos. And of course, the very dedicated patrons of Countdown to Classic. An extra special shout out and thank you from the bottom of my heart to Billy C, Firespit Kitten, Flosy B, Carl W, Nick B, Palfurus, Romani, Tsunami, The Anton, Wilson Ma, and Velarco. Thank you so much for your phenomenal support of the show. Countdown to Classic would not be the same without your support. But that's it from me for the day, everyone. So, signing off from Down Under, have a great rest of the week. It's Countdown to Christmas.